Dexter Morgan versus Jack the Ripper sounds like a mismatch from the first frame. On paper, Dexter should annihilate him. A trained blood spatter analyst in a modern homicide unit, living in a world of DINA, CCTV, and interagency databases, guided by a meticulous code. Jack is a shadow in the fog with a bloody knife and no plan beyond escape. And yet, when we line up outcomes, risk, and the actual investigations around them, the comparison quietly flips. Jack walks through filthy Whitechapel alleys, leaves mutilated bodies in public streets, and still evaporates into history without a single confirmed name. Dexter builds plastic-wrapped kill rooms, studies case files, and keeps trophies in labeled slides. Guess which one ends up with an entire task force and a nickname like the Bay Harbor Butcher? The paradox is simple and uncomfortable. The killer with more control leaves a louder trail. So the central question here is not who would win in a fight or who has the higher body count. The central question is whose approach to killing, evasion, and long-term survival actually holds up once we treat both worlds as real and unforgiving. Whose methods survive serious scrutiny and whose mythology collapses the second we stop cheering for the cool shots and start thinking like detectives. In this video, we're going to use this unfair matchup to expose both of them. To keep this clear, the focus is not just on Dexter's most cinematic kills or Jack's most infamous crime scenes, but on competence, environment, and failure points. Every time Dexter's plan seemed flawless and then unraveled, every time Jack's supposed genius was really just Victorian incompetence, doing half the work for him. Dexter's code versus Jack's chaos. Modern forensics versus Victorian fog. A Miami Metro investigation with lab reports, chain of custody, and digital records versus a 19th century manhunt that contaminated scenes, lost evidence, and chased hoax letters. Each major section will track how these factors shape their trajectories, how Dexter's reliance on police data, clean rooms, and ritual patterns makes him legible, while Jack's crude brutality is protected by fear, confusion, and institutional failure. Because the thesis here is that this isn't even close, but not for the reasons people assume. Dexter's meticulousness, the very thing that feels like control, becomes a liability in an era where patterns are exactly what get you caught. Jack's legend, on the other hand, looks like brilliance only because we're staring through a fog of panic, press hysteria, and missing paperwork. Strip away the myth, and one of these men is less mastermind than Lucky Ghost. Along the way, we'll keep returning to that spine every time Dexter's plan fell apart, from investigations that circle his dump sites to colleagues who almost name him. We're tracking a life defined by collapse, not mastery. We'll be going full spoilers on Dexter, original series, and New Blood, and we're treating his world as if it were real data, not isolated cool moments. And the first step is simple. We have to rip the fandom armor off both killers and see what's left. When we do, one of them almost disappears on contact. When we strip that fandom armor off, something uncomfortable happens. Our usual Dexter versus Jack arguments fall apart almost instantly. We're not actually comparing two men at all. We're comparing a tightly scripted illusion of control to a historical fog where even the basic facts are contested. Most debates mash those together. They mix Dexter's fictional logic with Jack's tabloid legend, ignore the worlds these killers move through, and then argue about style. Who's cooler? Whose kills are more theatrical? Who has the better vibe? That's not analysis. That's merchandising. If we stay there, we learn nothing about survival under pressure. So to keep this clear, we're going to lock in specific categories. First, operational environment, technology, policing, and culture. Dexter lives in a world of NA databases, CCTV, interagency data sharing, and standardized crime scene preservation. Jack moves through 1888 Whitechapel, where there's no forensic science to speak of, no meaningful fingerprint use, and police are literally washing away evidence. Streets are packed, filthy, and dark, but the investigation tools are primitive. Second, personal methodology, how each man plans, selects victims, and executes the kill. Dexter has a ritualized process, a code, kill rooms wrapped in plastic, trophies in blood slides. Jack appears chaotic by comparison, fast blitz attacks in alleys, minimal staging, brutal mutilation, and then disappearance into the crowd. The central question here is not who looks more meticulous, but which methodology actually reduces detection risk inside its own ecosystem. That leads to our third category, exposure risk. Dexter's every move is entangled with forensics, witnesses, and patterns. His job puts him at crime scenes, his dump sites form clusters, his trophies become physical evidence. We've watched investigations like the Bay Harbor butcher case literally grow out of the safeguards he trusts. Jack, by contrast, leaves bodies that trigger terror and confusion, but almost no actionable trail by the standards of his era. Fourth, long-term survivability. How long can each trajectory last before collapse? We're not tallying body counts or brutality. The focus is not just on who kills more, but on how well each approach holds up against the constraints of their world and the inevitable investigation pressure. To keep this grounded, we're using a diegetic realism rule. We treat Dexter's universe as if its institutions and tech function roughly like our own, with all the digital footprints and bureaucratic consequences that implies. And we treat Jack through the best historical evidence we have, not the mythologized supervillain manufactured by newspapers and hoax letters. Along the way, we have to talk about failure states. With Dexter, we see the system break in detail. Brian's manipulation, Doak circling him on instinct, Trinity detonating his family. With Jack, we have a suspicious lack of reliable data. No confirmed identity, no clear aftermath. That absence is itself a kind of evidence about how little pressure the system could actually exert. One more boundary before we dive in. No supernatural buffs, no time travel, no Dexter with Victorian tech, or Jack with a forensics lab yet. First, we judge them in their native habitats, under their native constraints. In this video, we're going to stay clinical. This is a forensic breakdown of competence under pressure, not a celebration of violence. And now that the rules are set, let's kick things off where Dexter looks strongest, with Harry's beloved code, and watch how quickly that supposed safety net starts to unravel. Harry sells it like armor, a rulebook that turns a child with knives in his head into a controlled surgical force. But when we lay it out piece by piece, Dexter's code looks less like protection and more like a blueprint for exposure. To keep this clear, the code is simple on paper. Only kill proven killers. Gather your own evidence. Avoid innocence. Follow ritualized procedures. Stalking, plastic, the table, the confession, the blood slide. Then disappear back into a carefully constructed normal life as a blood spatter analyst, a coworker, a boyfriend, a husband, a dad. Stalk the target. Confirm the victims. Prepare the kill room. Leave no evidence. Fans read that as discipline. It filters his targets, slows him down, and gives him a moral framework that supposedly keeps him from impulsive, sloppy violence. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that fantasy of control, because it's the central question with Dexter. Is the code actually making him safer, or just making us feel better about watching him? Here's the paradox. Every extra step in that ritual, every added safeguard, is another contact point with the world. Surveillance runs, evidence collection, DNA testing, kill room prep. Each phase multiplies the number of cameras he walks past, databases he touches, people who could remember his face or his car. In a modern investigation landscape, that's not discipline, that's surface area. Think about his failure-adjacent habits that exist only because of the code. He stalks suspects outside their homes, their work, their favorite bars, lingering in parking lots that absolutely would have CCTV in real life. He breaks into police databases to confirm guilt, leaving digital fingerprints while he scrolls through sealed case files. He revisits crime scenes to satisfy his need for certainty, standing in places where forensic teams have already mapped angles and collected trace evidence. Every time he does that, the plan looks methodical, but the risk spikes. And psychologically, the trap is even deeper. The code doesn't just constrain Dexter, it reassures him. It tells him he is righteous, careful, almost sanctioned. That false sense of moral insulation makes him underestimate how visible his pattern really is. He believes the ritual equals invisibility. Even as blood-slides pile up, ocean dumps repeat, and colleagues like Dokes and Lagerta start seeing the outline of a predator hiding in plain sight. Now contrast that with Jack. No moral framework, no evidence checklist, no carefully staged kill rooms. Jack's chaos in Victorian London looks primitive next to Dexter's plastic-wrapped precision, but the absence of procedural constraints means fewer predictable rituals and far fewer self-imposed exposure points. No police intranet logins, no trophy system cataloging his crimes, no nightly reconnaissance runs that can be reconstructed from traffic cameras that, for him, simply don't exist. Along the way in Dexter's trajectory, we watch the code directly engineer disaster, keeping Dokes alive in that cabin, because the code forbids killing an innocent, giving Lila time to find him, insisting on a specific kill room setup for Trinity, which delays the strike and leaves Rita exposed, waiting for more proof against Travis in Season 6. Letting the doomsday investigation close in while Dexter clings to procedure. Each major section will dig into those collapses in detail. So, if the code is supposed to keep Dexter safe, why is it the common denominator in almost every time his plan completely falls apart? If the code keeps detonating in Dexter's hands, Jack the Ripper is what happens when there is no code at all. Just a man in the dark, a knife, and a city that can't see what's right in front of it. To keep this clear, let's kick things off with what Jack actually did, not what the legend claims. We have a loose pattern, vulnerable women in Whitechapel, narrow streets, public but badly lit corners where poverty is the real camouflage. He strikes fast, in the open, then vanishes into a maze of alleys and tenements. No stalking dossiers, no meticulous kill room, just rapid mutilations, a few minutes of frenzy, and then disappearance into the crowd before anyone can mount a real investigation. From a distance, that looks ghost-like. Up close, it looks like chaos that happens to benefit from the environment. The central question is, was Jack actually good at this? Or did history just grade him on a curve? For decades, people talked about surgical precision, as if he were some Victorian Dexter with a scalpel. But modern forensic pathologists reading those autopsy reports see something different. They see rushed cuts, hacked tissue, organs removed in ways that suggest rough familiarity at best. Not operating theater expertise. This isn't a methodical technician following a procedure. It's a man in the dark, improvising under time pressure, using brutality as his main tool of control. So why does he look like a mastermind? Because the real advantages were never his hands. they were his circumstances. No CTV on every corner. No dna. Fingerprints barely standardized. Crime scenes trampled by crowds before anyone thought to secure them. Slow communication between stations, no centralized databases, and a police force that didn't even have a word like serial killer to frame the pattern. In that world, leaving a body in the street and walking away was a viable plan. The focus is not just on what Jack did, but on how fear did the rest. Lurid headlines, letters that were probably hoaxes, sketches and nicknames, turning a local killer into a mythic monster. The mystery of his identity filled in every gap with imagined genius. Sloppiness became strategy. Luck became design. Public panic did more to protect him than any actual operational discipline. Look at the crime scenes themselves. Bodies dumped in public view. No meaningful attempt to hide evidence. Blood, footprints, potential fibers, all abandoned where anyone could see them. In a modern investigation, those locations would be a forensic goldmine. Under UV lights and lab analysis, Jack's chaos would light up like a confession. And that's the real contrast. Jack's success is that he was never caught. Dexter's success is that he survives multiple seasons under conditions Jack never had to face. One benefits from a blind system. The other is hunted by one. Dexter looks competent because we watch his internal logic. Jack looks competent because we never see his failures, only the gaps in the record. In this video, we're going to press on that gap. To understand why this comparison isn't even close, we have to put Jack's chaos under something he never faced: modern forensic pressure. The same pressure that keeps cracking Dexter's illusion of control, kill after kill. Jack moved through fog and gaslight. Dexter moves through fiber optics and fluorescent lab benches. That's the real mismatch. To keep this clear, we need to lay out the invisible enemy Dexter is always fighting, even on nights where everything looks under control. Modern forensics isn't just blood drops and fingerprints. It's DNA profiling, tying a stray hair to a specific body. It's trace evidence, fibers, soil, microscopic paint chips, clinging to shoes and car mats. It's CTV networks, watching parking garages and intersections, cell tower data quietly logging, which phones shared the same slice of sky, license plate readers tracking vehicles across bridges, and digital communication logs preserving every call, text, and ping long after the moment feels forgotten. Dexter loves the fantasy of the sealed kill room. Plastic on the walls, drains in the floor, knives laid out with surgical precision. But a kill room doesn't exist in a vacuum. He has to scout it. He has to drive there. He has to get his victim from a public space to that private chamber without leaving a pattern of cameras, toll booths, and potential witnesses who remember a nervous guy loading something into a car. Every perfect plan involves a route, a schedule, a cover story. Every route intersects with traffic cams and ATMs. Every schedule brushes up against coworkers, neighbors, or Harrison's bedtime. And even when no one is watching in real time, the city is still recording. That's the retroactive trap. Investigators don't need to catch Dexter in the act. They can rewind. A task force can pull toll records, cross-reference license plate hits, and reconstruct a suspect vehicle's trajectory across the city. Phone metadata can show that Dexter's device went dark right before a murder, or that it traveled in parallel with the victim's phone until both stopped in the same dead zone. These systems don't care about his psychology or his code. They just preserve movement, over and over, waiting for an investigation to connect the dots. This is where Dexter's day job stops being an advantage and turns into a pressure cooker. He knows the tests, the protocols, the blind spots. That knowledge lets him tweak blood patterns and contaminate slides. But it also means he's inside the very machine that is constantly updating its tools for catching people exactly like him. Every season, the lab gets new equipment, new databases, new interagency links. Each major section will show how that escalating sophistication quietly erodes his margin for error. Now contrast that with Jack's London. No standardized crime scene protocols. No centralized databases. No concept of offender profiling that could link behavior across cases. Limited coordination between precincts, and no technological memory of who walked where at 3 a.m. If Jack turned a corner and vanished into the dark, that was it. The city couldn't replay his path. His ghost status is less about genius and more about absence, of cameras, of chemistry, of data. Dexter doesn't get that luxury. His code demands surveillance of his targets, confirmation of guilt, elaborate staging. Every step of that ritual is a dance through a minefield of sensors he can't fully see. And now that we've mapped the pressure around him, we can start pulling on the thread that really unravels his legend, the kill room itself, the space he trusts most. Becoming the place where his plans begin to collapse. The irony is brutal. The one place Dexter calls sanctuary, the plastic cathedral where he believes the code is most in control, is actually where his entire trajectory is most exposed. Let's kick things off with the image burned into everyone's memory. A room shrink-wrapped in plastic, harsh overhead lighting softened just enough. A victim immobilized on the table, mouth taped, eyes wide. Dexter steps into frame with his tools laid out in surgical order, blood slides waiting, camera ready for the trophy shot. When the knife finally falls, we watch him wrap the body, slice down the plastic, scrub every surface, and disappear into the night. On paper, it's flawless. No fibers, no fingerprints, no blood spatter left behind. In this video, we're going to lean into why that feels invincible. The focus is not just on the ritual, but on the way the show trains us to trust it. The camera lingers on the bleach. We see the trash bags double-tied. We follow the boat cutting into black water as weighted bodies sink. The editing becomes a reassurance loop. Dexter planned this. Dexter controlled this. Therefore, Dexter is safe. It's a closed system. Or at least it looks that way. To keep this clear, we have to name the blind spot. The kill room is only as safe as the chain of events wrapped around it. Location scouting, access routes, victim transport, timing. Every time Dexter drags an unconscious body through a hallway, wheels a corpse-sized bundle down a loading dock, or parks his car just a little too long outside a warehouse, he's not in a sanctuary. He's in an active investigation zone that simply hasn't started yet. Because every kill room is a temporary crime hub. Dexter brings a living person, a weapon set, cutting tools, tape, his own hair and skin cells, into a space that already exists inside a larger ecosystem of neighbors, CCTV cameras, property records, and maintenance schedules. That empty house has an owner. That abandoned hospital has security. That dockside shed has a night watchman and a clipboard. How long until one of those mundane details collides with his ritual? And then there's the repetition. Same plastic sheeting, same table position, same slide trophies and ocean dumps. The very consistency that calms Dexter's psychology is exactly what profilers and data analysts hunt for. Patterns of access card swipes, recurring vehicle routes, missing persons vanishing along the same corridor of Miami. In a Victorian alley, Jack the Ripper could vanish into chaos. Dexter, by contrast, is building a structured pattern that modern investigation tools are designed to read. The more elaborate the setup, the more fragile it becomes. One power outage and the controlled lighting is gone. One unexpected visitor and the soundproofing doesn't matter. One victim who slips a restraint, one text they manage to send, one simple timing error, and the whole plan folds in seconds. We've already seen the near misses, people almost walking in, victims writhing off the table, Dexter abandoning half-finished rooms when reality hits the door. So if the kill room isn't actually safe, what happens when the outside world starts pushing back at exactly the wrong moment? When the ritual collides with an active manhunt, a watching colleague, or a city wired with sensors Dexter can't control? The answer is, the outside world is already in the room with him. Let's kick things off with the purest version of the fantasy. Plastic hung with surgical precision, drains taped, tools aligned in a perfect triad, scalpel, saw, slides, stalk the target, confirm the victims, prepare the kill room, leave no evidence. That's the plan. But every time Dexter thinks he's built a sealed environment, the real world leaks in through the seams. Take the nights when the victim doesn't play along. We watch supposed foregone conclusions turn into wrestling matches on wet plastic. A mark slips a wrist, bucks the table, catches Dexter with a headbutt that leaves him dazed. Tape tears. A light crashes. The carefully arranged room becomes a crime scene in progress. And suddenly, he's improvising with one hand, while the other is mashing plastic back onto exposed skin. The ritual speech? Gone. The blood slide? Sometimes forgotten entirely, until he's already in the car, realizing the gap in his own code. Then there are the footsteps in the hallway. A landlord checking a noise. A night shift security guard rattling the doorknob of a vacant space. A patrol car parking just outside the abandoned building he thought no one used. We hold our breath as Dexter freezes, blade hovering, listening to keys scrape metal. To keep this clear, these are not cinematic flourishes. They're operational failures. He misjudges timing. He assumes isolation. He trusts that a flimsy lock is enough to hold back an entire investigation if someone gets curious at the wrong second. External chaos doesn't care about his psychology either. A sudden power outage plunges the room into darkness mid-cut, leaving him with a half-dismembered body and an electric saw stuck in dead silence. A fire alarm shrieks through an industrial block, sprinklers threatening to soak his plastic, smear his prints, and send firefighters straight toward the empty unit with the covered windows. Nearby police activity turns a forgotten warehouse into the center of a perimeter, red and blue lights strobing through seams in the tarp while Dexter has to choose between finishing the kill or vanishing and leaving a half-prepped altar behind. Each time, control collapses the same way. He cuts the ritual short. He skips cleanup steps. He leaves fibers in ceiling vents, adhesive residue on floors, tiny voids in the blood pattern he would normally correct. In a modern forensic landscape, one partial print on a light switch, one stray hair fused into duct tape, one security camera he didn't notice catching him hauling equipment at 3 a.m. is enough to start a thread. And once that thread exists, a real investigation can pull it straight through his entire trajectory. Contrast that with Jack the Ripper. Jack never builds a room. He never returns to the same controlled environment that can be mapped, surveilled, or pattern matched. He strikes in open, filthy streets, then dissolves back into the crowd. No plastic to trace. No recurring blueprint for detectives to chart. The focus is not just on brutality, but on the absence of a ritual space that can betray him. In this video, we're going to keep following that pressure outward, because the kill room is only one arena where Dexter's plans implode. The real collapse begins when the whole police apparatus, from lab techs to manhunts, starts closing in on the Bay Harbor butcher in ways Jack never had to survive. If the kill room is Dexter's private arena, the squad room is his daily minefield. He doesn't stalk from the shadows like a Victorian phantom. He clocks in at Miami Metro Homicide, surrounded by detectives, analysts, and a whole bureaucracy whose stated mission is to find people exactly like him. To keep this clear, Dexter's cover isn't a disguise he puts on once a week. It's his entire workday. He runs blood spatter for homicides, feeds data into case management systems, listens as Batista, Deb, and LaGuerta connect dots across seasons of violence. Every new body on a slab is a potential pattern. Every briefing is a quiet referendum on whether the Bay Harbor butcher has stayed invisible or just hasn't been named yet. Modern investigation turns that pressure into a constant hum. DINA databases, ballistics networks, digital warrant trails, task forces spun up overnight when a series of bodies even looks like a cluster. Behavioral profilers flown in to map offender psychology, cross-jurisdiction data sharing that flags similar signatures states away. Dexter lives inside the machine that catches serial killers, feeds it, optimizes it, and then has to pray that his own ritual doesn't surface as a recognizable trajectory. Think about the Bay Harbor butcher case. From a few missing persons and some ocean anomalies, we get coordinated searches, interagency briefings, and eventually hundreds of trash bags dragged off the seabed. That's not Victorian guesswork. That's a system designed to turn scattered remains into a single name. The central question for Dexter is, never will there be an investigation. It's how long before this investigation eats its own forensic technician. Now contrast that with Jack the Ripper's London. Multiple police forces tripping over each other, no centralized files, no standardized crime scene preservation, and almost no concept of serial offending as a distinct profile. They relied on gaslight patrols, unreliable witness statements, and a media circus that flooded them with hoax letters instead of usable leads. Jurisdictional turf wars meant clues died in filing cabinets. Public pressure pushed them into reactive patrols, not proactive pattern analysis. Jack wasn't outsmarting a modern manhunt. He was moving through a fog that didn't even have the language to name what he was. Jack was a problem the system didn't know how to frame. Dexter is a problem the system has been explicitly training to detect for decades. And crucially, his colleagues are not faceless incompetents. Dokes follows his instincts until they burn a hole straight through Dexter's fade. LaGuerta resurrects old evidence and nearly reconstructs the Bay Harbor butcher from patterns alone. Deb is emotionally invested in the hunt for predators, which means she's emotionally invested in exposing the very code Dexter thinks protects her. In this video, we're going to keep asking, how does someone live under that microscope and still believe in control? Because as we move forward, we'll see exactly how often that microscope nearly catches him, in the moments when his plans collapse. His safeguards fail, and the investigation he feeds every day turns around and points straight at him. That microscope doesn't just nearly catch him. At a certain point, it swivels, locks on, and Dexter Morgan stops being the analyst in the lab and starts being the unnamed suspect in the room. The hunter becomes the hunted. And every plan he's built to stay invisible is suddenly stress tested by a system designed to break alibis and expose lies. Let's kick things off with the Bay Harbor butcher investigation, because this is where the trajectory flips. We have a full task force, federal attention, media pressure, and a pattern built from Dexter's own trophies. Those blood slides he keeps for control, they become the statistical glow around his crimes once Lundy arrives and starts treating the case like a modern serial killer profile rather than a local curiosity. The ocean dumps, the dismemberment style, the victim selection, all of it tightens into a net that he can't easily cut his way out of. To keep this clear, notice how the anomalies begin as tiny hairline fractures. A missing piece of evidence here, an odd forensic result there, an inconsistent timeline when Dexter is allegedly at home, but his phone pings near a crime scene. Doak's instincts, Masuka's lab work, even Deb's questions about his late nights, all feed data into the same machine. Dexter isn't just hiding from one suspicious cop. He's hiding from an investigation he helps power every single day. And his response is to push back, to manipulate the investigation itself. He plants evidence to frame Dokes, steers colleagues toward convenient suspects, and stages scenes to redirect suspicion. On paper, it works. In practice, every new lie creates a new dependency. Dokes has to die at the right time. Leela has to play her part. The task force has to accept a narrative that barely holds together. What happens if even one person hesitates, asks the wrong follow-up question, or checks one more camera angle? Along the way, Dexter's personal relationships stop being shields and start becoming investigative assets. Rita tracks his odd hours and emotional distance. Deb vents about her brother to fellow officers who are already looking for behavioral patterns. In New Blood, Angela Bishop literally uses her romantic proximity, online databases, and interagency sharing to reopen the Bay Harbor butcher case, with Dexter sitting at her dinner table. They don't know they're hunting him, but they're feeding the system clues about his psychology and movements in real time. Under that pressure, his code phrase, he improvises more. He rushes kills, cuts corners, abandons standard operating procedures. The central question becomes, how long can a man obsessed with control survive when every improvisation leaves a new trace? Jack the Ripper never faced this. No DNA, no CTV, no digitized case files, no sustained, data-driven manhunt with his name and face attached. Public panic, yes, but nothing like a coordinated apparatus slowly orbiting one man. And as that orbit tightens around Dexter, his greatest strengths, his access, his rituals, his careful patterns, stop protecting him and start betraying him. In the next section, we'll watch specific plans not just wobble under that scrutiny, but collapse outright as the noose stops being theoretical and starts closing in beat by beat. That theoretical noose doesn't just tighten in interview rooms and task force briefings. It tightens every time Dexter touches a screen, swipes a card, or drives under a traffic light. Let's kick things off with the basic reality Jack the Ripper never faced. Dexter's life is embedded in machines. Cell phones that ping towers, GPS units in squad cars, credit card readers at gas stations, work computers at Miami Metro, police databases, DMV records, traffic cameras silently cataloging plates at intersections. Even when he's not hunting, he's inside a lattice of timestamps and coordinates. To keep this clear, even cautious behavior can't erase that presence. Turn the phone off, and the last tower ping still marks where it died. Pay cash, and the ATM withdrawal is logged. Borrow a different car, and its plate still passes under the same network of cameras. Every login at work is timestamped, every badge swipe recorded, every query against a victim's name stored in an audit table Dexter never sees. And Dexter can't follow the code without diving straight into those systems. The focus is not just on his plastic and knives, but on the investigations he has to monitor and manipulate. He researches victims online, pulls restricted case files, checks missing persons reports, and tracks active investigations to avoid collisions. That means search histories, access logs, and database queries, all sitting on servers that do not care about his plan or his psychology, only about recording activity. We see the edges of that risk multiple times. Think about the Bay Harbor butcher investigation, when Lundy's team starts correlating dump sites, victim backgrounds, and internal access. Or when Dexter deletes and alters files to protect Lumen and erase traces of the Barrel Girls case. That deleted data is still an event. A missing report. A suspicious gap. Even LaGuardia's later digging into the Butcher case hinges on patterns in old records Dexter assumed were buried by time, not realizing modern investigations can resurrect almost anything. This is the paradox hook at the center of Dexter's modern vulnerability. The smarter he tries to be, the deeper he goes into the digital maze. Each major section of his life as a killer depends on more queries, more background checks, more quiet, late-night sessions on police terminals. Every extra step he takes to be sure of a target under the code quietly adds another line to an invisible indictment. Contrast that with Jack's world. No electronic records, no CTV grids, no way to retroactively reconstruct years of movement with a few keystrokes. Once Jack stepped away from a gaslit alley, the trail was blood on cobblestones and unreliable memory. When Dexter leaves a scene, the trail is metadata. And that's before we even talk about the physical layer. If the digital world is already recording Dexter against his will, what happens when we factor in cameras, witnesses, and the random chaos of the street that no spreadsheet can predict? If metadata is the invisible net around Dexter, cameras are the visible eyes. The modern city is a lens farm. Street corners, parking garages, building lobbies, ATMs, traffic lights, convenience stores, and now private doorbell systems, quietly watching the sidewalk 24/7. Jack the Ripper never had to think about any of this. Gaslight, fog, and human eyesight were his only constraints. If a witness blinked, looked away, or got scared, the record vanished with them. There was no objective replay, no way to freeze the moment and zoom in on a face, a license plate, or a blood smear on a jacket. Dexter, by contrast, lives in a city where every plan has to be storyboarded against that web of surveillance. When he scouts a location, he's not just looking for exits and places to hang plastic. He's tracing camera cones, blind spots, and the exact second he can pass through a frame without being tied to a victim's last known movements. Following a target that's not just tailing, it's weaving through an invisible grid that can reconstruct his trajectory long after the night is over. We see this pressure most clearly in moments where the cameras almost win. Think about the times a victim is seen on CCTV entering a garage, a bar, or a side street, and Dexter is one frame away from sharing that shot. All it takes is a reflection in glass, a distinctive car, or a timestamp that overlaps his shift, and suddenly he's scrambling. He manufactures alibis, nudges the investigation, or discovers footage that conveniently corrupts. The central question isn't whether he can kill cleanly, it's whether he can edit himself out of the city's memory. And then, there are the people cameras can't predict. The dog walker cutting through a lot at 2 a.m. The neighbor who can't sleep and starts idly watching the street. The teenager on a balcony, phone in hand, who notices Dexter's SUV circling one too many times. One odd look, one partial plate, one description of a man moving plastic-wrapped bundles into a boat, and the investigation suddenly has a thread to pull. Modern detectives are trained to pull that thread. To keep this clear, they don't just interview witnesses in isolation, they canvass for footage, match statements to angles, and stitch together a narrative that spans blocks and hours. A victim leaves a bar on camera, passes 3 doorbells, crosses an ATM frame, and then vanishes. Every gap becomes a question mark. Every recurring vehicle, every repeated route pushes Dexter's supposed control toward failure. Jack's London had no such stitching. Witnesses contradicted each other, memories decayed, and without a visual anchor, the story stayed fractured. Jack could walk away, and the night would blur behind him. Dexter can't. His reliance on routine, the same car, similar routes, familiar dumping grounds, turns into a pattern that multiple camera systems can recognize long before any one cop gets a feeling. Each major section will show how that pattern recognition tightens. Because if cameras and random bystanders can nearly undo Dexter's best-laid plans, what happens when his own psychology starts sabotaging him from the inside too? So let's kick things off inside the one crime scene Dexter can never process objectively, his own head. On paper, he's the controlled predator, the Bay Harbor butcher, guided by a meticulous code, a man who believes that if the plan is clean, the consequences will be contained. But the closer investigations press in, the more that self-image looks less like control and more like a story he tells himself to stay functional. From the Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force, building a profile that sounds uncomfortably like him, to Laguerta quietly reopening that same case years later, we see the same psychological pattern. Stress rises. Dexter doubles down on the code. Then the cracks widen. In this video, we're going to track how that pressure doesn't just threaten his body, it scrambles his psychology, which in turn sabotages the very plans he thinks are keeping him safe. Under pressure, Dexter's cognitive biases go into overdrive. He leans on overconfidence, trusting past success as proof that the next kill room will work out. He locks into tunnel vision, obsessing over one threat while ignoring another. He treats low-probability risks as basically impossible. To keep this clear, think about Season 2. He's so fixated on Dokes that he underestimates Lila, the FBI, even random divers stumbling on his dumping ground. The trajectory is consistent. The more hunted he feels, the narrower his thinking becomes. Then we add emotion, the thing his code pretends he doesn't really have. Family, love interests, colleagues, each attachment bends the rules. He spares Brian longer than he should. He hides Trinity for the sake of his own research. He covers for Hannah. Each exception is framed as a calculated adjustment, but it's not. It's emotional entanglement, distorting risk assessment. We watch him rush kills that violate his own ritual. The night he goes after Dokes in that cabin, he's improvising in the swamp with gasoline and a body he didn't even create, letting Leela solve his problem. Later, with Travis Marshall, he drags a bound victim into a church already crawling with symbolic meaning and police attention, because he needs that personal, poetic ending. Deb walks in. The facade shatters. That's not the code operating. That's urgency, guilt, and ego overriding the very safeguards Harry designed. Guilt and fear create competing priorities the original rules were never built to handle. Protect the code. Protect the family. Protect the job. Protect the mask. What happens when those plans collide in one night? We get the hospital chaos after Rita's death, the spiraling lies to Deb, the final Iron Lake meltdown, where protecting Harrison and protecting the facade become mutually exclusive. Contrast that with what we can infer about Jack the Ripper. His spree is short, brutal, and psychologically narrow. No double life at a homicide desk. No daily proximity to an active investigation. No wife, kids, and coworkers whose needs constantly force trade-offs. His inner world may be monstrous, but it's operationally simple. The focus is not just on who is smarter, but on how complexity itself becomes Dexter's enemy. His mind turns into another unstable environment, full of shifting justifications and fractured control, and as that collapses, so does the reliability of his planning. Along the way, a pattern emerges. Once you combine that psychological erosion with modern forensics and surveillance, Dexter's failures stop being rare accidents and start looking disturbingly predictable. So what happens when those internal fractures meet the full force of a contemporary manhunt? So when those internal fractures hit the full force of a contemporary manhunt, Dexter's life starts to look less like a chess match and more like a slow-motion collapse. But before we crown Jack the Ripper as the killer who would have handled it, we need to strip his legend down to something colder. Myth versus reality. Because the Jack most of us picture, he's already a special effect. Let's kick things off with that popular image. A cloaked phantom gliding through foggy alleys, surgically precise, always one step ahead of the investigation. He studies organs like a Victorian Hannibal Lecter, taunts Scotland Yard with clever letters, and then vanishes at will, leaving detectives and newspapers in awe of his genius. That's the story. That's the brand. It feels like the dark passenger in its purest, most controlled form. But when we look at the actual record, the central question shifts from how was he so brilliant to is there anything here that proves brilliance at all? We have a handful of confirmed murders, maybe 5 canonical victims in a tiny area. The modus operandi isn't perfectly consistent. The mutilations vary. The supposed surgical skill? Hotly debated, with no clear evidence of real medical training. Even the famous letters that built his name, from Dear Boss to From Hell, are almost certainly hoaxes, written by journalists or cranks chasing attention, rather than a mastermind executing a plan. In this video, we're going to lean on something Victorian London didn't have: hindsight. To keep this clear, we have to talk about newspapers as much as knives. Late 19th century papers were in a circulation war. They exaggerated details, printed wild speculation as fact, and turned Jack the Ripper into a ready-made brand decades before marketing psychology had a name for it. Every new headline inflated his control. Every lurid illustration upgraded a messy, chaotic offender into an omnipotent shadow. And because the case was never solved, that inflation never had to answer to reality. No arrest, no trial, no confirmed face, just a void where an identity should be. And into that void, we pour intelligence, planning, even moral codes he never demonstrated. When there's no final season, no last episode, where the mask comes off, we project whatever level of competence we want. Now layer in the investigative limitations. No DNA. Primitive fingerprint use. No standardized crime scene preservation. Overcrowded streets, poor lighting, undertrained officers, and a bureaucracy that could barely coordinate, let alone run a modern manhunt. In that environment, any moderately cautious killer who didn't confess or self-destruct had a huge advantage. Evasion wasn't proof of superior control. It was often proof of institutional failure. Compare that to Dexter's trajectory. Years of killing under digital surveillance, inter-agency databases, forensic audits, and colleagues trained to see patterns his own bloodslides create. Jack's operational window is short, brutal, and noisy. Dexter's is long, strained, and constantly buckling under pressure. Which is the harder test? A brief burst of anonymity in a chaotic system, or sustained concealment in a world built to catch you? Once we frame it that way, Jack's success starts to look less like a duel he won, and more like a game the other side never knew how to play. So, if Jack's genius is inflated, and Dexter's competence is already eroding, what happens when we strip both down to cold operational metrics and ask who actually runs a tighter kill? So let's kick things off by attacking the assumption we've all quietly been carrying. Methodical equals smart, chaotic equals dumb. Dexter looks like a chess player. Jack the Ripper looks like a brawler. One has a code, a plan, a ritual. The other staggers through foggy alleys with a bloody knife and vanishes into the crowd. On the surface, isn't this matchup already over? In this video, we're going to flip that instinct on its head by changing the metric. The central question is not who looks more controlled, but who is more detectable. Because the moment we shift from style to survivability, order stops being automatically impressive and starts becoming a liability. The The more structured and ritualized the behavior, the easier it is to model, predict, and eventually catch. Dexter is the definition of structure. Stalk the target, confirm the crimes, prepare the kill room. Plastic on every surface, specific restraints, the same tools. The same post-mortem disposal in the same stretch of ocean. He selects a particular victim type. He revisits crime scenes through case files. He takes blood slides as trophies. Each of those pieces soothes his psychology. Together, they create a signature, a pattern that an investigation can link, chart, and project forward. We've already seen how that plays out. The Bay Harbor Butcher case is literally built from the ritual Dexter believes proves his control. Those slides in his air conditioner become the spine of a task force. Dokes doesn't need Dina. He reads the rhythm of Dexter's movements, the late nights, the missing evidence. Season after season, the code and the ritual that are supposed to prevent collapse instead give law enforcement a shape to chase. Jack's violence, by contrast, looks messier. Inconsistent mutilations, shifting levels of overkill, bodies in different parts of Whitechapel rather than a single dumping ground, and crucially, a short spree that stops before the pattern hardens in the public mind. Was there a logic behind his choices? Almost certainly, but it isn't ritualized in a way that creates a neat behavioral blueprint. To keep this clear, we're not praising Victorian policing. Jack benefited from an era with no Dina, primitive fingerprints, and chaotic crime scene handling. Yet even in that forgiving environment, his relative lack of ritualistic complexity made him harder to categorize. There was terror, there were headlines, but there was no clean, repeatable code for investigators to decode. Modern policing punishes ritual. CCTV, digital trails, interagency databases, behavioral analytics, all of these tools feed on repetition. In Dexter's world, chaos can function as camouflage. Randomized locations, varied methods, no trophies, no consistent victim profile, those are the things that starve pattern recognition systems. But Dexter won't do that, because his order isn't purely tactical, it's emotional. The code is a story he tells himself to manage guilt, to justify the dark passenger, to maintain the illusion of moral control. It calms him. It does not necessarily protect him. So if order isn't automatic strength and chaos isn't automatic stupidity, the matchup changes. The focus is not just on who seems smarter, but on whose approach actually survives contact with reality. And that's where we go next, into the cold operational metrics, where we start putting numbers, timeframes, and exposure windows on both men and see whose trajectory really holds. So to keep this clear, we need to stop treating Dexter versus Jack the Ripper like a vibes-based crossover battle and start treating it like an investigation. Up to this point, we've already watched Dexter's supposed advantages turn into liabilities. The code that locks him into patterns, the kill rooms that become elaborate traps, the modern forensics and surveillance net that tightens every season. Meanwhile, Jack's legend keeps floating above the filth of Whitechapel, even though most of his genius is environmental luck and institutional failure. From a plastic-wrapped kill room in Miami to a blood-slick alley in 1888 London, we're going to put both men on the same scoreboard. The central question is not who looks smarter in a montage, but who actually survives. Who maintains operational secrecy when the world pushes back? Who can keep killing without their own plan becoming the noose? To do that, we're going to use a simple framework. Exposure, risk per kill. Adaptability under pressure. Environmental difficulty. Longevity potential. Each major section will take one of those categories and drill down with concrete examples, Dexter's documented failures and near misses on one side, Jack's thin, but telling historical footprint on the other. Exposure risk means we look at every time Dexter's control collapsed into an evidence trail. The blood slides that built the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation. Dokes following his instincts straight into a cage next to Dexter's trophies. Trinity slipping through Dexter's fingers long enough to annihilate Rita and blow up the family fantasy. Against that, we set Jack's murders occurring in a tiny, densely populated area with no Dina, no CTV, no standardized crime scene protocol. Was that brilliance? Or just a world that never really saw him? Adaptability and environmental difficulty are where the technological gap becomes brutal. Dexter is playing on hard mode, Dina databases, interagency data sharing, cameras on street corners, digital footprints, every time he checks a file or tracks a target. And yet, he still insists on ritual, on a code that tells him who he's allowed to kill and how. Jack is on easy mode by comparison, walking through crowds with a bloody knife and vanishing into gaslit streets, and he still doesn't present as methodologically sophisticated. He benefits from chaos more than he creates it. Longevity potential is where we stop romanticizing. Winning here is not moral. It's not cinematic. It's staying unidentified. It's dying free. In this video, we're going to treat survival as the only real scoreboard, and the consequences of every misstep as points against that. Along the way, we'll see the gap widen. When we strip away style and myth, Dexter versus Jack the Ripper isn't even close, and that imbalance tells us more about the systems around them than about lone wolf brilliance. Next, we start tallying, failure by failure, and lucky break by lucky break, until the matchup stops feeling like a fantasy fight and starts looking like a cold, uncomfortable ledger. So when we line Dexter up against Jack the Ripper, we're already cheating the comparison. One moves through a world designed to see him. The other moved through a world that was functionally blind. Let's kick things off with Dexter's basic surveillance stack. Every time he leaves his apartment, he's walking through a grid of CCTV cameras, traffic cams, storefronts, parking garages, ATMs. His car passes license plate readers that timestamp his trajectory across the city. His gas stops and plastic-wrapped purchases hit digital banking systems. His burner phones still ping towers and generate metadata. Even his day job, the thing that supposedly gives him control, logs his badge, swipes into the lab, the evidence room, the marina. The system is always writing a biography of his movements, whether he wants it or not. To keep this clear, we have to remember what Jack's London looked like. No cameras, no centralized records, no Dina, no meaningful fingerprints, no standardized crime scene preservation. Beat cops walked their routes with no real-time radio, no instant alerts, no interlinked databases. If Jack slipped down an alley and wiped his knife on his coat, that disappearance wasn't supernatural skill. It was infrastructure failure. Now map Dexter's ritual onto that difference. Stalking a target means following them through malls and parking lots already under video. Abducting them means a car changing lanes on a toll road, a plate caught at 2:17 a.m., a neighbor's ring cam in new blood picking up a taillight. Transporting the body? That's GPS breadcrumbs, fuel receipts, and traffic cams catching the same vehicle circling the same industrial park. The kill room itself is a nightmare of potential footprints. Hardware store purchases, plastic sheeting orders, cleaning chemicals, all tied to bank cards and store loyalty programs. Then there's disposal. Ocean dumps that once felt invisible become patterns in Coast Guard logs and boat slip records. A random burial in Iron Lake becomes a heat map on a search team's GPS, a drone pass, a cadaver dog's alert. Every step of Dexter's plan, from syringe to garbage bag, generates data that someone can later rewind. Jack never had to fight that. His ghost-like exits from Whitechapel alleys are less about a mastermind evading an investigation and more about the absence of any durable record. In this video, we're going to keep pressing that paradoxical thesis: the less a system can see, the more we mythologize the killer as invisible. The focus is not just on Dexter's mistakes, but on the unavoidable friction of a hyper-documented society. What looks like incompetence when Dexter's car shows up on a traffic cam or his boat usage forms a pattern is often just the cost of existing inside modern bureaucracy. Meanwhile, Jack's supposed brilliance largely survives because there is nothing to audit. So when people ask, who's the better killer? We should really ask, who's being measured at all? Each major section will keep dragging the matchup back to that question until Jack's legend starts to look less like genius and more like a crime scene with no camera. Next, we'll watch how, season by season, that surveillance net tightens around Dexter, turning every minor slip into a potential collapse while Jack stays frozen in a permanent blind spot. That tightening net isn't abstract. It has lenses, timestamps, and hard drives. When we put Dexter and Jack side by side, the central question shifts from who's smarter to who's even visible. One man lives in a world where every errand is an entry in a database. The other moves through streets that might as well have been erased every sunrise. Let's kick things off with the basic geography of control. Modern Miami isn't just palm trees and neon. It's a stitched-together grid of cameras. Parking garages mount fisheye domes on every level. Traffic lights watch from all four corners of the intersection. Convenience stores keep a constant digital memory of every customer. Apartment lobbies, elevators, mailrooms, even the empty loading dock out back, all recorded, all time-coded. All searchable in an investigation that never really sleeps. Now, run a simple Dexter plan through that maze. He spots a target leaving a bar. There's a street-facing camera over the door, another catching license plates in the lot, a third inside the ATM kiosk where he waits in the shadows. He follows in his car. That route is carved into traffic cams, red light cams, maybe a toll booth archive. He pulls into a warehouse district. There's a motion-triggered unit on the corner, a security system on the neighboring business, maybe a passing Uber dash cam catching his car in the background. Even if he avoids obvious angles, how many silent witnesses just logged his trajectory without his consent? Jack the Ripper, by contrast, steps off a curb into fog. No CTV. No dash cams. No body-worn police video. He ducks down an unlit Whitechapel alley, and the record collapses to human memory. Drunk, terrified, prejudiced, and easily manipulated. To keep this clear, the focus is not just on what they do, but on what the world can prove they did. For Jack, the world could prove almost nothing. For Dexter, the world is constantly, passively building a case file. Dexter's story keeps rubbing his face in that reality. The gas station camera that catches a suspect car, the building surveillance that forces him to move a body faster than planned, the dash cams and street cams that make New Blood feel like he's hunting inside a glass box. Each season, technology shoves his code into a smaller cage, until improvisation becomes less a choice and more a permanent state of emergency. Jack never had to worry about any of that. His mystery is inseparable from the fact that no one ever captured his face, his gait, or even his real clothing on film, because film, in any practical sense, did not exist for the police. No primitive fingerprint work, no standardized crime scene preservation. Is that genius, or just an era where the city itself refused to remember? Along the way, this is what breaks the fantasy matchup. Dexter fights both victims and infrastructure. Jack only fought victims. And in the next section, when we fold in forensics and digital footprints, we'll see just how brutally lopsided that really is. So when we say Dexter is fighting infrastructure, this is what we mean. He lives in a world that remembers him even when he thinks he's invisible. Jack the Ripper walked through fog. Dexter walks through databases. Let's kick things off with the everyday ghosts that log Dexter's existence. Hospital ID, badges that track when he swipes into Miami Metro. Time cards that mark the start and end of every shift. Toll transponders quietly recording his car slipping over bridges at 2 a.m. Cell tower pings, drawing a rough outline of his movements across the city. Credit card swipes for gas, knives, trash bags, and last-minute flights. Email servers archiving every urgent message to Deb or Batista that explains why he's late, why he's gone, why he was nowhere near the crime scene. Individually, each of these feels harmless. Together, they form a shadow timeline Dexter doesn't control, and crucially, he can't fully hack or erase it. The central question isn't just whether Dexter can clean a kill room, it's whether he can clean the network of systems quietly insisting he was here. To keep this clear, we have to contrast it with Jack's world. Cash-only economies where money left hands, but not records. No standardized IDs, no driver's licenses, no social security numbers tying a man to one consistent identity. Minimal census or residency enforcement, so a lodger could change boarding houses 3 times in a month and leave behind nothing more than an impression on a mattress and a name no one could verify. In Whitechapel, anonymity wasn't a trick, it was the default setting. Dexter, by contrast, is pinned down by his own routine. Think about how investigations into him start. Stokes doesn't just feel something off, he watches Dexter's odd hours, his unexplained absences. Later, the Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force reconstructs ocean dump runs and work schedules. In New Blood, Iron Lake Police pull cell data, security footage, and purchase histories to rebuild his movements. The focus is not just on blood and bodies, but on where Dexter's car was when his phone went dark. How his badge activity doesn't match his alibis. Each major section will show this same pattern, a plan that assumes he can disappear and an investigation that patiently proves he can't. Along the way, detectives aren't just chasing a man, they're querying systems that Dexter never fully anticipates. Jack never had to face that. His clean escapes after each murder feel legendary, but they're really a byproduct of a world where a searchable, centralized trail simply didn't exist. No CCTV to catch him turning a corner, no nationwide database to flag a drifter with a violent past, no cross-referenced logs to say, this man keeps appearing near every mutilated body. Is that cunning, or just the absence of friction? In this video, we're going to keep pressing that gap, because when we move from abstract trails to specific forensic evidence, the matchup doesn't just tilt toward Jack, it collapses entirely. So let's step into the place Dexter thinks he's safest, the kill room. Plastic everywhere, victim taped down, tools laid out with surgical precision. It looks like total control. But once we break down the logistics, we see what Jack the Ripper never had to worry about. An entire Rube Goldberg machine of failure points waiting to collapse. To keep this clear, walk through the plan. Dexter has to scout a location, sometimes for days. He studies access routes, security cameras, patrol patterns. Then he has to secure that space without drawing suspicion. Bring in rolls of industrial plastic, tape, tools, and a bound or drugged human being, all while living inside an active police investigation. After the kill, he has to clean every surface, transport the body, dismember it, and dispose of it in a way that fits his code and doesn't ping any surveillance system. Every step promises control. Every step multiplies risk, and the show keeps proving it. The ice truck killer finds one of Dexter's early rooms and turns it into a message board, repainting Dexter's private ritual as public theater. Dokes tracks Dexter's off hours and literally catches him mid-setup in the Everglades cabin, turning a supposed sanctuary into a cage Dexter now has to burn, frame, and abandon. In Season 2, divers pull up his neatly wrapped garbage bags from the ocean, transforming his perfect disposal method into the Bay Harbor Butcher case file. The kill room isn't just a stage, it's evidence. We get a vivid failure montage across the series. Rita's house with the plastic still up when she's nearly home. The church with Travis Marshall on the table as Deb walks in. The gym where Dexter strings up Travis's disciple and leaves behind security footage. New Blood's cabin, where Harrison and Angela can reconstruct his entire psychology from the way he binds and displays his victim. Each room Dexter builds is a future crime scene, waiting for the right investigator. The central question becomes unavoidable. What happens when your ritual is so consistent it turns into a pattern? Dexter's plastic, his taped victims, his cheek slice for blood slides, his preference for abandoned spaces near water, that's a behavioral signature. It's something Lundy can profile, something Masuka can notice in the lab, something Angela can cross-reference with missing persons and cold cases. The focus is not just on his mistakes, but on how his very need for order creates a readable trajectory. Now contrast that with Jack. No rented spaces, no plastic, no transport vans or ocean dumps. Jack's kills are opportunistic street ambushes, fast, brutal, left where they fall. Messy, yes, but he walks away with nothing to dismantle, no kill room to revisit, no elaborate ritual that has to be reconstructed night after night. Victorian policing fails to contain him, but he also gives them far less structure to decode. In this video, we're going to keep pressing that irony, because when we move from the rooms Dexter builds to the people those rooms endanger, the illusion of control doesn't just crack, it takes everyone around him down with it. Dexter walks into a crime scene and sees a story written in blood. Jack the Ripper walked through his crime scenes and left nothing but panic. That gap between interpretation and chaos is where the matchup between them completely collapses. Let's kick things off with the basic forensic reality. Modern blood is loud. Spatter pattern analysis turns every droplet into a trajectory line. Luminol pulls ghost stains out of supposedly clean walls. Denotyping takes a microscopic flake and ties it to a specific body, a specific file, a specific life. In Dexter's Miami, blood isn't just there or not there. It's a full investigation waiting to happen, even after bleach, even after meticulous scrubbing. Dexter knows this. It's his day job. The central question for him is never just, can I kill this person? But can I survive the lab on Monday morning? That knowledge gives him a tactical edge. He understands cast-off, voids, expirated spray, what a white pattern looks like under oblique light. To keep this clear, his whole plan depends on staying ahead of people who think like he does. But that same expertise also makes him painfully aware of how fragile his control really is. One drop in the wrong place, one fiber on the wrong shoe, and the code doesn't save him. Science buries him. We see the psychology of that tension everywhere. Early on, a single blood slide in the wrong hands nearly detonates his entire life. Dokes doesn't need Dina. He just needs a pattern, a ritual, an object Dexter thought was invisible. Later, a tiny smear on his boat helps the Bay Harbor Butcher case crystallize, turning what he thought were clean ocean dumps into a readable disposal trajectory. These aren't spectacular blunders. They're microscopic failures. A smudge, a trace, a sample that should have burned but didn't. Each major section will show a version of this same collapse: a tooth left in a drain, a drop on a lamp, a partial print that survives the fire. Along the way, Dexter's own lab work circles back toward him. The investigation he helps build to catch other killers is the same machinery that could, at any moment, decode him. Now, put that next to Victorian Whitechapel. No luminol, no Dina typing, fingerprints barely standardized, crime scenes trampled by crowds and washed down by police who think they're cleaning up. For Jack, blood is binary. It either shocks the witnesses or it fades into filthy cobblestones and butchers' aprons. There is no way to reconstruct precise sequences of blows. No way to say this droplet came from that man. So Dexter, the blood expert, lives in a world where every mistake echoes forever, while Jack, the butcher in the fog, moves through a city that erases him by default. And when we shift from blood to relationships, that same forensic precision starts cutting into Dexter's personal life even deeper. And that precision becomes even more damning when we look at who Dexter is being compared to. Because while Dexter's world is built on microscopes and chain of custody, Jack the Ripper is operating in a forensic vacuum, so complete it almost functions as a cloak. The central question isn't who was smarter, it's who was even visible to the tools of their time. To keep this clear, we need to zoom in on what 1880s investigators actually had. No Dina, no fingerprint databases, no standardized way to collect, store, or even think about trace evidence. Fingerprints as an identification method are just emerging on the fringes, not embedded in any real investigation. Crime scene photography is sporadic. Blood typing doesn't exist yet. A body in the street is not a data set to be reconstructed, it's a spectacle to be cleared away. And spectacle is the right word. Crowds pour into those Whitechapel alleys before the first constable can even push them back. Curious onlookers, local residents, journalists, even other officers trample through the mud and blood. Hats brush against walls, coats smear against door frames. Boots grind through pooled blood and discarded fabric. By the time anyone tries to preserve the scene, preservation is already a failure. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that contrast. Dexter obsessively taping vents and bleaching drains, while Jack's victims are literally carried indoors so the street can reopen. Imagine trying to run a modern investigation on a body that's been moved, clothing rearranged, witnesses dispersed, and half the neighborhood has already walked through the area. That's not a brilliant killer outwitting the system. That's a system that never had control. Even if Jack had slipped, the investigation had no way to see it. Say he cut himself and left blood at the scene. There is no serology to distinguish his blood from the victim's in any meaningful way. Say a hair falls from his coat or fibers tear from his scarf. There is no database, no comparison microscope culture, no lab report that can tie that hair to a specific man rather than to millions of similar men in similar clothes. So when we talk about a perfect crime in 1888, what are we really describing? Not flawless planning, not some supernatural code of invisibility. We're describing investigators who are blind to evidence we now treat as basic. Fingerprints, touch DNA, fiber analysis, even consistent note-taking. Each major section will keep dismantling this myth of Victorian cat and mouse genius, because there was barely a cat and almost no mouse. Along the way, that forces us to downgrade Jack's legend. His trajectory looks less like a mastermind and more like a man shielded by chaos, fear, and institutional collapse. And when we finally drop him into Dexter's century, that forensic free pass disappears almost instantly. So when we drop Jack's chaos into Dexter's century, we also have to flip the experiment. What happens when we drop Dexter's meticulous plan into Jack's world and then reverse it? Because the central question isn't just who's smarter, it's who's actually being hunted by a system built to crush them. Let's kick things off with the modern side, because that's the water Dexter swims in. The second a serial pattern even whispers into existence today, departments mobilize. You get task forces spun up overnight, interagency databases lighting up with victim profiles, vehicle sightings, financial records. Media alerts blast out composites and timelines. If the case crosses state lines, or just feels big enough, federal agencies move in with profilers, behavioral analysis, and digital forensics that can pull a life story out of a single phone ping. That's the default. That's the baseline pressure. Dexter lives under that pressure constantly. He's not dodging a single overworked inspector. He's embedded inside an institution whose entire psychology is designed to find people like him. Internal affairs, ethics boards, supervisors watching budget and clearance rates. Every season, the investigation tightens. Doak stalks Dexter on pure instinct. Lundy's Bay Harbor Butcher Task Force uses the blood slides Dexter thought were trophies as a statistical roadmap. Later, Laguerta reconstructs dump sites and victim patterns that were supposed to vanish into the ocean. Dexter isn't just avoiding suspicion, he's operating while being actively profiled by colleagues who have literally trained their entire careers to catch his exact behavioral pattern. To keep this clear, we have to contrast that with 1888 Whitechapel. There, the manhunt for Jack is less a coordinated dragnet and more a jurisdictional argument happening on filthy, overcrowded streets. You had the Metropolitan Police on one side, the City of London Police on the other, overlapping, but not truly cooperating. Communication was slow, record-keeping inconsistent, and class prejudice meant that the lives of impoverished sex workers didn't command the same resources as crimes in wealthier districts. Detectives walked crime scenes that had already been trampled, with no DINA, barely any fingerprint standards, and crowds gathering before officers could even establish a perimeter. How do you hunt what you can't even preserve on paper? This is where Jack's legend deflates. He's not outwitting a modern task force. He's slipping through a fragmented response that can't agree on letters, suspects, or even which murders are officially his. Many of the infamous Ripper letters are likely hoaxes, yet they still diverted manpower and warped public fear. Dexter, by contrast, is hunted by a system that not only understands serial homicide as a category, but has built entire protocols, databases, and career paths around choking it off. Along the way, that difference in pressure becomes the real mismatch. Jack is pursued by a system barely capable of understanding what it's looking at. Dexter is pursued by a system that, sooner or later, will understand him too well. And when we move from institutional pressure to personal confrontation, that gap only gets wider. If the last section was about systems tighten around Dexter, this one is about the spotlight. Not just who's hunting him, but how many eyes are watching the hunt in real time. In this video, we're going to lean into that pressure cooker. Because once you add a 24/7 news cycle, true crime podcasts live, tweeting every development, and Reddit threads dissecting body language at press conferences, the investigation stops being a quiet procedural and becomes a national spectacle. Departments are no longer just solving a case, they're defending their competence, their budget, their reputation. That changes every plan they make, and it changes Dexter's margin for error. Think about the Bay Harbor Butcher. One leak about a diver finding trash bags off the coast, one reporter hungry for ratings, and suddenly Miami Metro is doing daily briefings, fielding questions about forensics, timelines, and internal oversight. Stare at that podium long enough, and you can almost see Dexter's control evaporating. The more the press demands transparency, the more internal reviews, task forces, and interagency data sharing kick in. Each major section will spawn new databases, new analysts, new eyes on the exact crime scenes Dexter thought he'd cleaned. To keep this clear, the focus is not just on the official investigation, but on the rumor mill orbiting it. A patrol cop vents to a girlfriend about a weird blood pattern. A lab tech brags in a bar about a high-profile case. A neighbor posts a blurry photo of police tents going up at a marina. In a modern environment, those tiny leaks don't just vanish, they get aggregated, theorized, and weaponized by an audience trained by true crime media to hunt patterns. How long before someone online notices that our quiet blood spatter guy is always near the center of the storm? We've seen versions of this inside the narrative. Deb's press conferences, LaGuardia's public insistence that the Bay Harbor butcher is still out there. The way a single televised appeal can flush out new tips that bypass Dexter's carefully curated channels. Even when official leads are thin, the sheer volume of noise can shove investigators closer to him. A composite sketch, aired at 6 p.m., becomes 100 he looks familiar calls by midnight. A podcast episode speculating about a vigilante code nudges someone who knows Dexter's psychology just enough to start asking the right questions. Now contrast that with Jack the Ripper's media environment. Victorian newspapers were sensational, yes, but they were slow, regional, and often wildly inaccurate. No CTV stills on the front page, no instant push alerts. No way to crowdsource suspect sightings or circulate a composite sketch to millions overnight. By the time a broadsheet finished printing breathless details about one murder, Jack was already walking the same foggy streets, planning the next. That narrative lag is his hidden ally. Public terror is high, but coordination is low, and the collapse between crime and coverage never really closes. Dexter never gets that luxury. His trajectory plays out under wall-to-wall coverage, where every misstep can become breaking news. And when that spotlight finally swings from the murders to the man behind them, the confrontation stops being theoretical. So what happens when the myth of the righteous killer collides with someone who doesn't believe the story at all? It starts with something deceptively ordinary. A man in a short-sleeved shirt, badge on his belt, laughing by the coffee machine with the very people hunting the monster he is. Dexter doesn't just avoid the investigation. He helps run it. Every break room joke, every late-night briefing, every crime scene debrief is a performance where the mask cannot slip for even a second. Let's kick things off with Dexter's daily reality. He doesn't vanish into an alley after a kill and disappear into statistical noise. He clocks in at Miami Metro. He processes the blood from his own crime scenes. He stands over bodies he created, pointing out spatter trajectories to Batista, while silently checking whether a stray drop betrayed his plan. Control for Dexter is not just about plastic wrap and knives. It's about micro-behaviors, when to look horrified, when to crack a joke, when to be just detached enough to pass as a forensic technician instead of a suspect. That's where the colleague problem comes in. These people see him every day. They notice patterns. Stokes doesn't just get a bad feeling. He tracks Dexter's odd absences, his emotionless reactions, his habit of showing up just a little too prepared. The central question for Dexter is not only can I hide the body, but can I explain where I was when it died? We watch him improvise lies about rehab to cover his nocturnal rituals, scramble for excuses when his boat trips don't match his story, and feign shock at crime scene photos that he basically staged. Think about the vivid failure montage we've already seen. Dokes cornering him at the marina. LaGuardia reopening the Bay Harbor butcher case because the evidence never truly fit. Masuka joking about Dexter's weirdness. while unknowingly circling the truth. Each moment is a tiny structural crack in the fate of normalcy. A reminder that the very colleagues who give him access are also a jury of trained observers waiting for the wrong twitch. Now contrast that with Jack the Ripper. Jack's colleagues, if we can even use that word, were an anonymous mass in Whitechapel: factory workers, dock laborers, men who could vanish into overcrowded lodging houses with no HR department, no time cards, no detectives, sharing coffee 2 desks over. He moved through a fog of poverty and overpopulation where nobody was logging his overtime. Asking why he missed the morning briefing, or comparing his statements across multiple interviews. To keep this clear, Jack didn't have to manage a daily ensemble cast. He just had to avoid being the one unlucky man stopped in a dark street. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to this asymmetry. Jack benefits from a world before modern forensics, before CCTV, before interlinked databases. Dexter, by contrast, embeds himself inside the machine. His inside man advantage, access to case files, crime scene photos, police gossip, also means he lives under constant, professional scrutiny. He is surrounded by people whose entire job is to notice anomalies in behavior and evidence. How long can you maintain that performance before the investigation quietly shifts from the bodies on the table to the man holding the blood slide? Along the way, that pressure doesn't just threaten Dexter's operations, it warps his psychology. Every lie to Deb, every cover story for a missed family event, every panicked adjustment when a coworker gets too close, pushes him further out of genuine connection and deeper into the code as a failing life support system. And that's the real divergence from Jack. Jack hides in the crowd, Dexter hides in plain sight, until the people standing closest decide to stop believing the story. Jack hides in the fog of Victorian London. Dexter hides in the floodlight of a forensic age. And that's where Harry's code stops being a moral compass and starts functioning as a built-in self-destruct device. Let's kick things off by revisiting the most famous line of that code: only kill those who deserve it. On paper, it sounds like control. In practice, it forces Dexter to become an investigator before he ever becomes a killer. He can't just act on impulse. He has to run background checks, access case files, linger at crime scenes, and quietly reopen closed investigations his colleagues think are finished. Every time he does that, he's not in the shadows. He's on the grid. Think about how many pre-kill sequences look almost identical. Dexter at his lab computer, Dexter sneaking into evidence, Dexter tailing a suspect through the city, stalk the target, confirm the victims, prepare the kill room. That triad feels methodical, but in a world of CV, traffic cams, and badge access logs, it's also 3 separate chances for the Bay Harbor butcher to leave a trail. When he surveils Trinity, for example, he's not the only one watching. Bank cameras, neighborhood security systems, police stakeouts around active crime scenes, they're all quietly recording his movements while he convinces himself he's being careful. The central question isn't just whether the code keeps Dexter ethical. It's whether that elaborate moral filter actually makes him easier to catch. To keep this clear, look at the contrast with Jack. Jack doesn't need to prove guilt. He doesn't need to cross-reference victims, test a theory, or piggyback on an existing investigation. He operates in alleyways, not databases. When Jack sees opportunity, a drunk woman alone, a blind corner, he acts. Fewer steps, less planning, almost no pre-crime footprint. In 1888 Whitechapel, there are no license plate readers logging Jack's route, no cell towers pinging his location, no forensic techs cataloging microscopic fibers from his coat. The investigation collapses under bad policing, media hysteria, and the sheer absence of tools. In Miami, by contrast, every extra move Dexter makes to satisfy the code is one more data point waiting to be correlated later. That's why dokes can track him on instinct alone. The pattern is there because Dexter builds it. So Dexter's code isn't just a psychological burden he carries in voiceover, it's an operational tax he pays on every kill. More research, more proximity to active investigations, more time in places where colleagues, cameras, and random witnesses can place him at the wrong scene. And along the way, those costs compound. The blood slides, the marina rentals, the late-night stakeouts around suspects already on Miami Metro's radar, they all become receipts the universe saves for later. In this video, we're going to keep watching how that tax accrues interest. Because once a single piece of that moral operational machine fails, the reconstruction begins. And Dexter's fantasy of perfect control meets a system designed to replay his every step. So when we talk about reconstruction, we have to talk about Jack. Because Jack the Ripper is what happens when an investigation collapses and the empty space gets filled with imagination. We have maybe a handful of facts, a cluster of murders in Whitechapel, a rough time frame, some mutilations, a few dubious letters. That's it. Against that tiny core, we've stacked more than a century of theories, suspects, novels, movies, and edgy Halloween costumes. The ratio of data to mythology is absurd. Let's kick things off with that imbalance, because it's the engine of Jack's supposed genius. When we don't know who someone was, where he lived, how he picked victims, or even which murders were actually his, we start reverse engineering intelligence from a void. He wasn't caught, so he must have been brilliant. He vanished, so he must have had a plan. But that's survivorship bias in its purest form. We remember the killer who slipped away and forget the dozens of violent men from the same era who were arrested, hanged, or quietly disappeared into asylums. To keep this clear, imagine lining them up. On one side, Dexter Morgan, whose entire trajectory is documented in forensic detail, blood patterns, crime scene photos, GPS pings, security cameras, coworkers, family, a full narrative of plans and failures. On the other side, Jack, whose profile is a silhouette built from newspaper panic and later pop culture, who looks more controlled only if we ignore the fact that one of them is basically a rumor with a body count. And when we strip away the legend, Jack's actual methods look crude. Dark alleys, drunk or desperate women, a quick blitz attack with a knife, organs removed in filthy conditions, then a stumbling escape through overcrowded streets. No kill room, no plastic, no attempt to sterilize a scene or manage long-term consequences. The crime scenes are chaotic, contaminated, and often mishandled by police who had no standardized protocols, no DNA, barely any usable fingerprints. Yet in modern retellings, Jack gets upgraded into a surgical mastermind, a Victorian Dexter with a top hat and a scalpel. In this video, we're going to lean into that contrast. The focus is not just on what Jack did, but on what we've projected onto him, because there's nothing solid to push back. If we turned the same forensic lens on Jack that we turn on Dexter, if we had blood spatter analysts, CCTV timelines, digital footprints, and a season-long investigation tracking every misstep, how long would his mystique last? Would we still talk about a criminal genius, or just another violent opportunist shielded by bad lighting and worse policing? Along the way, that question loops back to Dexter's myth of control. If Jack's legend can inflate from almost no evidence, what happens when we have the opposite problem? A killer whose every move is recorded, archived, and replayed. That's where the matchup stops being romantic and starts being uncomfortable. Because once we apply real scrutiny, one of these monsters looks a lot more ordinary than the story wants him to be. So when we talk about Jack the Ripper's genius, we're already giving too much credit to the man and not enough to the maze he moved through. The central question isn't just who was smarter, it's which environment quietly tilted the entire investigation before it even began. Let's kick things off in Whitechapel, 1888. Think of streets that are barely streets, narrow alleys choked with refuse, blind corners, and back passages that double back on themselves like a nervous system. Gas lamps sputter instead of shine. Fog clings to brick and cobblestone, turning every footstep into a rumor. You can cross from a crowded pub to a pitch-black yard in seconds. And once you turn that corner, you are gone. No cameras, no radios, no standardized perimeter control. To keep this clear, the geography wasn't just creepy set dressing. It was infrastructure-level assistance. Overcrowded lodging houses packed transient men into shared beds, faces no one remembered, names no one checked. Labyrinthine backstreets gave Jack 100 exit routes and the police maybe 2 or 3 plausible guesses. Any plan he had could be loose, reactive, even sloppy, because the streets themselves erased detail. By the time an officer arrived, the scene was already half contaminated by curious neighbors and panicked onlookers. Then we add poverty and stigma, and the failure of the investigation stops being mysterious. Jack's victims were poor women, often sex workers, in a district the rest of London treated as a moral landfill. Their lives were already framed as consequences of vice, not tragedies demanding justice. Witnesses were drunk, exhausted, or afraid of being dragged into court. Why cooperate fully with a system that barely acknowledged you as human? Why risk losing a bed in a lodging house by admitting you saw something at 3 a.m.? Silence wasn't just fear, it was survival. And over all of that, fear and rumor spread like a second fog. Sensational newspapers published hoax letters and wild theories, turning Jack into a brand long before we had the word. Every shadow became a suspect. Every man with a medical bag, a foreign accent, or a stained coat transformed into a potential killer in the public imagination. How do you run a rational investigation when half your leads are hysteria and the other half are deliberate hoaxes? How do you separate psychology from evidence when terror is driving both? Now contrast that with Dexter's Miami. Open highways, wide causeways, neon and sodium vapor streetlights burning through the dark. This is a city built for cars, not foot chases through alleys. The focus is not just on Dexter's code, but on the grid he operates inside: CCTV at marinas, traffic cams on bridges, databases logging every arrest, every missing person, every boat registration. Even a flawed department like Miami Metro is structurally more capable than Victorian London's patchwork of beat cops and competing jurisdictions. Dexter's whole plan depends on that structure. He raids case files, piggybacks on forensics, and times his kills around active investigations. That gives him precision, but it also pins him to a visible trajectory. Phones log his movements. Lab records track his access. Colleagues notice when he's late, when evidence vanishes, when patterns line up a little too neatly. Jack could vanish into a crowd of strangers. Dexter has to vanish inside a system that is literally designed to notice. Along the way, this flips the matchup on its head. Jack's success is inseparable from a city built to lose him. Dexter's failures are inseparable from a city built to catch him. And if we really want to test their legends, we have to ask a much more uncomfortable question. What happens when we swap their environments and strip away the excuses? So when we swap their environments and strip away the excuses, we land in Dexter's world, where the background itself is hunting him. Every streetlight, every login, every camera is a quiet accusation. To keep this clear, we can track it through the moments where that invisible network suddenly becomes visible, and Dexter's illusion of control cracks on contact with modern systems. Let's kick things off with something Jack the Ripper never had to fear: traffic cameras. Think about Dexter tailing a suspect at night, confident in his shadows, only for the investigation later to pull up municipal footage that shows his car passing the same intersection as the victim, twice at 2 a.m. One plate number, one timestamp. In a Victorian alley, that's nothing. In Miami Metro's database, that's a thread. It's the kind of small, automated notice that forces Dexter to improvise new lies, fake errands, and retroactive alibis, each one another moving part that can fail. From there, we move inside the lab, where his supposed sanctuary becomes an audit trail. We watch as routine inventory checks flag missing blood samples, mislogged evidence, or a slide that should be in storage but isn't. These aren't dramatic confrontations. They're emails, spreadsheets, quiet questions in the hallway. And yet every minor discrepancy pulls the investigation closer to Dexter's ritual, turning his meticulous trophies into liabilities. The very tools he uses to validate the code are the same tools that can expose its existence. Then, we zoom out to the bigger data structures, database queries that stitch his movements together across seasons. A detective runs a search for officers present at multiple crime scenes. Dexter's badge number pops up again and again, clustering around bodies he just happened to process. A license plate reader catches his car near a dumping ground. Phone records place him in the wrong sector at the wrong time. These systems don't need to be brilliant. They just need to be consistent. The failure is baked into the environment, and every time he wriggles free, the escape plan spawns new risks. He hacks a database to erase a connection, which leaves an it footprint. He swaps evidence to redirect suspicion, which creates a mismatch another tech can notice. He leans on a colleague to sign off on a report, pulling yet another person into a chain of potential collapse. Along the way, the central question stops being, how does he kill without getting caught, and becomes, how long can he survive inside an investigation that never sleeps? The focus is not just on close calls as isolated thrills. It's on a trajectory where modern infrastructure functions like a second antagonist, one that Jack never had to outsmart. Dexter isn't just facing detectives, he's facing the city's memory. And as we'll see next, once you add actual humans, friends, family, prots into that already hostile system, the margin for error doesn't just shrink, it disappears. Modern infrastructure functions like a second antagonist. But even that can trick us into thinking the killers who survive inside it are somehow better than the ones who slip through historical cracks. Survival feels like proof of competence. It feels like control. And that's exactly where our psychology misleads us. Let's kick things off with the central question, hiding underneath every Dexter vs. Jack debate. Does not getting caught actually mean you were more skilled, more evolved, more in command of your plan? Or are we just mistaking chaos, timing, and institutional failure for genius? To keep this clear, we have to strip away the mythology and look at the machinery. Randomness matters. Victim selection matters. Investigative luck matters. A killer who targets marginalized sex workers in an overburdened Victorian district with no DNA, no CCTV, and barely standardized crime scene preservation is not playing the same game as a blood spatter analyst who kills cops, criminals, and pillars of the community in a city wired with cameras and databases. In this video, we're going to lean into that contrast, because Dexter is the perfect case study in how high skill does not erase vulnerability. He is meticulous. He stalks, confirms, prepares the kill room, he builds a code, a ritual, a narrative about control. And yet, across season after season, we watch that structure collapse under pressures that have nothing to do with his intelligence and everything to do with environment and chance. Dokes doesn't find Dexter because Dexter is uniquely sloppy. Dokes finds him because working side by side with a forensics tech gives him proximity, patterns, and instinctive suspicion. The Bay Harbor Butcher investigation doesn't ignite because Dexter suddenly forgets his plan. It ignites because his blood slides, his ocean dumps, and his access to police systems create a readable pattern in a world built to notice patterns. Even when Dexter wins, like when Leela removes Dokes from the equation, that survival is contingent on other people's chaos, not pure competence. Jack the Ripper, by contrast, benefits from the opposite dynamic. No coordinated interagency databases, no Dina tying him to a single cuticle, no digital footprint logging his movements through Whitechapel. His victim pool is transient, impoverished, easy for authorities to dehumanize and ignore. Media frenzy manufactures letters, hoaxes, and fear that scatter the investigation before it ever coheres. Does his continued anonymity prove brilliance? Or does it expose how low the bar for survival was in that specific context? The focus is not just on who killed better, but on whose environment demanded more actual competence simply to last a few years. Dexter operates in a system designed to catch him, and still evades it for over a decade. Jack moves through a system barely capable of preserving a crime scene, and becomes a legend mostly because no one could follow through. Along the way, we start to see the paradoxical thesis: the more advanced the world, the more a killer's survival reflects real, tested skill, and the more their inevitable exposure reveals how fragile that skill always was. And when we add Dexter's relationships back into this equation, that fragility turns catastrophic. So when we stack Dexter against Jack the Ripper, we're not just comparing two killers. We're comparing two completely different games, played on two completely different boards, with two completely different referees looking the other way. To keep this clear, let's start with Dexter's side of the ledger. From the pilot onward, he's operating under constant surveillance, CCTV on every corner, digital case files, GPS data, phone records, and a city where every crime scene becomes a media event by sunrise. His plan is never just kill and disappear. It's kill, clean, dodge the cameras. Manipulate the investigation he's literally working on, and still make it home in time for family breakfast. Every season tightens that net. Dokes watching him on pure instinct. LaGuerta reconstructing dump sites from Coast Guard logs. New Blood turning Iron Lake into a pressure cooker of body cams, drones, and viral rumors. On top of that, Dexter wears his own handcuffs, the code. He can't just stab a witness, torch a crime scene, or vanish into another country whenever he wants. Harry's rules, his job, his kids, his need to look normal, all of it functions as self-imposed surveillance. Every line of plastic wrap is also a line he refuses to cross. How many times does that restraint turn a clean kill room into a slow-motion collapse? Now shift to Jack. No DNA, barely any fingerprint use, no standardized crime scene preservation. An overworked, undertrained police force trudging through filthy streets while newspapers fabricate letters and nicknames faster than investigators can even secure a perimeter. Jack's structural advantage isn't genius, it's anonymity baked into the environment. He moves through overcrowded alleys where people disappear without paperwork, strikes in darkness lit by gas lamps, and leaves behind bodies that are contaminated before anyone thinks the word evidence. In that world, a bloody apron and a quick walk home can be enough. The investigation fractures across jurisdictions, misinformation explodes in the press, and the killer dissolves into the fog. The focus is not just on what Jack did, but on what the system could never do in response. Once we normalize for those conditions, the matchup looks very different. Dexter staying hidden for years while embedded inside Miami Metro, under active manhunt as the Bay Harbor Butcher, then reinventing himself in Iron Lake under modern data sharing. That's operational competence under fire. Jack leaving chaos in a city already drowning in it. That's a low bar disguised as legend. The central question stops being who's the better killer and becomes who survives when the world is actually looking. And this is where the stacked deck matters. Dexter's failures are visible because the system around him works well enough to expose them. Jack's success is invisible because his world never really tried. So if the matchup isn't even close, what does that say about the monsters we choose to mythologize? And what happens when we bring Dexter's relationships, our own psychology, and our hunger for these myths into the same frame? If Jack's advantage is the era, Dexter's disadvantage is the rulebook he carries into it. Before we even get to the investigation, we have to sit with this. Dexter walks through a modern forensic landscape, chained to a moral and operational checklist that never stops multiplying his exposure. Let's kick things off by naming that checklist. Only kill killers. Never get caught. Leave no trace. Honor Harry. On paper, it looks like control. In practice, it's a sprawling project plan, background checks, crime scene access, stalking routines, blood verification, kill room prep, body disposal. Every safeguard is another moving part that can break. The code isn't just a leash on his psychology, it's a blueprint for failure. To keep this clear, think about how often the code forces Dexter into riskier behavior. In Season 1, he doesn't just take the ice truck killer's bait, he keeps engaging, because he needs to understand this killer before he can ethically act. That delay gives Brian time to study him, to infiltrate his past, to weaponize the code itself. With Dokes, Dexter can't simply disappear him when the suspicion spikes. He has to be sure Dokes is guilty. That hesitation strands him in the Everglades, drags Lila into the orbit, and ends with Dokes framed and burned. The plan was caution. The consequence is escalation. Again and again, the ritual drags him back into danger. He revisits scenes to collect blood. He breaks into houses to confirm evidence. He transports plastic-wrapped bodies to the same ocean graveyard until the Bay Harbor Butcher pattern practically writes itself for the task force. Each major section will later show a new version of this, but the pattern is already visible. The more faithfully Dexter obeys Harry's rules, the more predictable his trajectory becomes. Now contrast that with Jack the Ripper. No articulated code. No elaborate pre-kill investigation beyond choosing vulnerable women in Whitechapel. Little consistency beyond victim type and general location. That chaos, that lack of a clear ritual, made him harder to profile, harder to anticipate, and easier to mythologize. Victorian policing couldn't even standardize crime scene preservation. They were not going to reverse engineer a psychology from a handful of bloody alleys. Here's the paradox at the center of this matchup. Dexter is supposedly more disciplined, more evolved, the serial killer who adapted to the age of Dina. Yet that discipline generates a repeatable pattern. Jack's sloppiness, his era's filth and confusion, resists pattern-based policing almost by accident. Who is actually safer, the man with the code, or the man the system can't pin down? And then there's Harry's voice. It doesn't just restrain Dexter, it interrogates him. Every impulse is cross-examined in his head. Every slip triggers overcorrection. That's how we get him rushing to move bodies when storms hit, re-entering active investigations to retrieve a slide, improvising new lies that leave fresh traces. It's like he's carrying a second detective inside his skull, one who never closes the case and never lets the plan stay simple. In a pre-forensic world, Jack could vanish into the crowd with blood on his hands. In Dexter's world, the very rigidity that promises safety becomes a liability. So what happens when that rigid code collides with real relationships, shifting loyalties, and people who won't stay inside his neat categories? When that rigid code meets real people, it doesn't just bend. It shatters in slow motion, and every shard is someone Dexter claims to love. Harry designs the code for a lone predator. Hunt at night, leave no trace, trust no one. Total secrecy, total isolation, total control. But Dexter's cover story requires the opposite. He needs to be a coworker who laughs at the water cooler, a husband who comes home for dinner, a brother who answers late-night calls, a father who shows up for school events. Every one of those roles is a surveillance camera pointed back at him. To keep this clear, the central question isn't does Dexter care about people? It's what happens to a code built for solitude when it's forced to operate inside a family system. The focus is not just on his psychology, but on the operational consequences. Every time he bends the rules to shield someone, he creates a new witness, a new confidant, a new loose end the investigation can tug on. We see it with Debra, with Rita, with Harrison, with Hannah. He lets Deb in emotionally, then literally into his secret in season 7, turning the best cop on the force into the biggest liability on his trajectory. He clings to Rita as proof he can be normal, which means lying about late nights, injuries, and missing evidence. He drags Harrison from Miami to Argentina plans with Hannah, compounding felonies with fantasy. Each choice feels like protection in the moment. Each choice deepens the lie and raises the stakes of a single slip from awkward to catastrophic. The Rita Trinity chain is the cleanest example of this failure in motion. Dexter identifies Arthur Mitchell, confirms the ritual, sets up the classic plan, stalk, verify, prepare the kill room. But he also decides to study Trinity as a model of long-term balance, to keep his family intact while honoring the code. He delays the kill to preserve his cover, attends family dinners, plays the friendly neighbor. Those extra days give Trinity time to discover Rita, time to reach the house, time to turn Dexter's suburban fantasy into a bloodbath. Protecting Rita by maintaining the mask is precisely what gets her killed. In this video, we're going to keep contrasting that with Jack the Ripper's void. No spouse to notice late nights, no coworkers to question bruises, no kids to leave behind in a bathtub. Victorian London gives him anonymity. Modern Miami weaponizes connection. Detectives interview friends, pressure siblings, tap phones, pulls CCTV of every associate. Dexter's loved ones become investigative pressure points before they ever become victims. And every time he chooses the code over transparency, he chooses more lies over small, survivable truths. The collapse, when it comes, is never gentle. Along the way, the very system he believes will protect his family keeps painting targets on their backs. So what happens when the only tool he trusts to keep people safe is the thing that keeps marching them toward the edge? The thing Harry never really accounted for is that a ritual is not just comforting, it's incriminating. The very pattern that makes Dexter feel in control is exactly what turns his life into a solvable equation for anyone patient enough to run the numbers. Let's kick things off with the image we all know: a room shrink wrapped in plastic, a target taped to a table, photos of their victims staring back from the walls. A syringe, a confession, a single blood drop pressed onto a slide, labeled, boxed, and hidden like sacred scripture. Then the cleanup, every surface wiped, every trace collected, the body carved and bagged, weighted and dropped into the same stretch of ocean, night after night. Dexter thinks this is precision. To modern homicide investigation, this is repetition. And repetition is where patterns live. To keep this clear, pattern recognition is the backbone of contemporary profiling. Detectives are trained to hunt for repeatable elements, victim type, location clusters, signature behaviors, disposal methods, case-linking software flag similarities, geographic profiling maps, hot zones, interagency databases stitched together what used to be isolated files. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to the same uncomfortable truth. The more Dexter perfects his plan, the more visible he becomes to the systems built to decode routine. That's why Dokes, Lundy, and LaGuerta don't close in because of one spectacular failure. They close in because the anomalies stack. Dokes feels the dissonance first. The blood spatter guy who's always near the weird scenes, who disappears on the nights bodies vanish offshore. Lundy sees the macro pattern. Dismembered criminals, no clear offender, a statistical ghost orbiting Miami. LaGuerta later reopens the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation and starts lining up boat logs, case files, and Dexter's proximity. None of them need a smoking gun at the start. They just need a rhythm that doesn't match ordinary crime. And then there are the slides. The trophies Dexter believes are purely psychological, his private proof of control. Once Dokes finds that box, those glass squares stop being therapy and become evidence. Each slide encodes a victim, a date, a rough timeline of activity. When the investigation catches up, his interior mythology is literally sitting on a lab table. Turning his psychology into physical data, the central question stops being, is there a killer? And becomes, who has access to all of this information, all of these victims, all of this blood? Contrast that with Jack the Ripper. Irregular mutilations, shifting alleys, possible copycats muddying every profile. No standardized crime scene preservation. No national database quietly connecting dots. His chaos, combined with Victorian incompetence, dissolves into rumor and myth. Dexter's order, inside a modern data ecosystem, hardens into a trail. The focus is not just on who Dexter kills, but how narrow his world becomes. Similar targets, similar prep, similar dumps, all within a tight Miami geography. Along the way, every database query, every boat trip, every ritualized scene adds another red pin to an invisible map. His greatest comfort is also the cleanest outline of his hunting ground. And as that outline sharpens, we're left with an unnerving setup. What happens when the city finally realizes there's only one man whose life intersects every point on that map? That invisible map around Dexter's life depends on order. Jack's world ran on the opposite principle. Jack the Ripper's hunting ground was the labyrinth of Whitechapel streets at midnight, gas lamps flickering, crowds spilling from pubs, alleys choked with fog and refuse. He struck in public spaces, in doorways and yards, then vanished into a human tide. No plastic, no prep. Just a knife, a few brutal minutes, and a disappearing silhouette. The scenes he left behind were chaos made visible. Bodies dumped where anyone could stumble over them, throats opened, organs removed, clothing hacked away in the dark. The attacks were rapid, frenzied, and then over, with Jack sprinting off before anyone understood what they were hearing. That visceral mess feels like a failure of control compared to Dexter's carefully taped walls, but in 1888, that very mess became a shield. Victorian police walked into those courtyards with almost no standardized crime scene protocol. Curious neighbors trampled the ground. Officers moved the body to get a better look. Journalists and even bystanders took souvenirs. Blood pooled, then washed into gutters. To keep this clear, every step of what we'd now call an investigation was contaminated before it even began. The more grotesque the scene, the more hands touched it. Jack's brutality generated panic, but not precision. Witness statements conflicted. Timelines blurred. The central question for detectives wasn't, what does the evidence say? But how do we calm this neighborhood down? In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that gap between spectacle and solvability. For Jack, the spectacle was the point. The mutilations overwhelmed the limited tools they had, so the horror itself functioned as noise that drowned out any signal. Dexter, by contrast, lives in a world where signal is everything. His kill rooms are surgical, controlled lighting, wrapped surfaces, drains accounted for, often with him literally wearing his own forensic knowledge like armor. But the irony is brutal. In a modern lab environment, the moment anything deviates from the plan, a stray hair, an unlogged movement, a camera he didn't notice, that very neatness gives investigators a clean, interpretable pattern to chase. Jack never had to worry about offender profiling because it barely existed. Early attempts to describe him were speculative, moralizing, and steeped in bias. Foreigner, butcher, mad doctor. Psychology as an investigative tool wasn't there yet. Each major section of the Victorian press coverage built a different monster. But none of those monsters were anchored in systematic behavioral science. Instead, rumors, hoax letters, and press hysteria turned Whitechapel into a narrative free-for-all. False leads weren't just common. They were the air everyone breathed. Jack's best tactic was simple. Do nothing different in his daily life. Let the Dear Boss letters and wild theories run interference. The fog of war formed around him without any additional plan. Dexter has to navigate the opposite environment. DINA databases, chain of custody logs, interdepartmental task forces, and Key-Tive grids, where one anomaly can become a task force briefing. His code is designed to survive scrutiny, but scrutiny is exactly what his era specializes in. That's the historical contrast that makes this matchup collapse. Jack's sloppiness would doom him today, but in his own world, it made him uncatchable. Dexter's neatness is lethal in his world, yet also the clean trail that, once disturbed, can finally lead everyone straight back to him. So, what happens when that trail really is disturbed? Not by an enemy like Jack, but by Dexter himself breaking his own rules. When that trail is disturbed, the hunt doesn't just intensify, it industrializes. One slip doesn't mean one detective getting suspicious, it means an entire machine waking up. Let's kick things off by walking through how a modern serial case actually escalates. First, there's the isolated homicide. One body, one crime scene, one overworked detective writing it up. Then a second, then a third. Patterns emerge in the blood, the wounds, the geography. Suddenly it's not just a case, it's a series. That's when the word task force appears in the briefing room, when federal databases get queried, when analysts start mapping victim profiles on big screens. In Dexter's world, we watch that escalation crystallize around the Bay Harbor butcher investigation. A few trash bags wash up. A diver finds a body part. Miami Metro realizes they're sitting on a dumping ground. To keep this clear, this is the exact moment Dexter's illusion of control starts to collapse under institutional pressure. The FBI sends Lundy. Interagency cooperation kicks in. Local cops, federal agents, forensic techs, even Coast Guard resources converge on one problem: who is using the ocean as a graveyard? The focus is not just on the bodies, but on the optics. Once the phrase serial killer leaks, the media frenzy becomes its own character in the investigation. 24-hour news wants a new angle every cycle. Talk shows speculate about the killer's psychology. Reporters camp outside the station. That noise rolls uphill into political oversight. Mayors, commissioners, union reps all start asking the same question. What's the plan, and why isn't it working yet? Under that pressure, show progress becomes a mandate. More overtime, more analysts, more scrutiny on every piece of evidence. That's why the Bay Harbor Butcher case doesn't just sit in a file cabinet, it gets whiteboards, press conferences, and a dedicated narrative the public follows season after season. Every lead is amplified, every failure is visible. Now contrast that with Whitechapel. In 1888, newspapers sensationalized Jack's murders, but policing stayed fragmented and reactive. No DNA, primitive fingerprints, no standardized crime scene preservation. Beat cops stumbled onto horrors, detectives compared notes in person, and rumors traveled by word of mouth and ink that could fade or be misfiled. Jack's genius is really a product of that slower, leaking information ecosystem. Dexter, by comparison, is trapped in the center of the storm he helps create. As a blood spatter analyst, he's literally in the room when they diagram how the Bay Harbor Butcher operates. He's advising on his own investigation. That dual role multiplies stress, decision fatigue, and the odds of a catastrophic error. How long can anyone maintain that split without slipping? And outside those rooms, modern technology keeps tightening the net. Tip hotlines flood with calls. Social media spins theories. Amateur sleuths freeze-frame news footage, dissect crime scene photos, archive everything forever. A strange car, a familiar face, a leaked detail. Nothing truly disappears. Jack could vanish into fog. Dexter lives in a world where fog is just another thing that shows up on camera. Under that kind of pressure cooker, even a tiny misstep doesn't just echo. It gets broadcast, replayed, and dissected indefinitely. So what happens when that misstep finally lands in the hands of someone close enough to recognize exactly whose pattern they're seeing? So what happens when that misstep doesn't land in a database or a camera, but in a pair of human eyes that refuse to look away? That's where Sergeant James Dokes walks in, and the entire fantasy of Dexter's control starts to burn. Dokes is not an algorithm. He's not a task force. He is the human embodiment of suspicion. Instinct-driven, relentless, completely immune to Dexter's polite, lab-tech camouflage. From the first season, every time Dexter smiles, Dokes squints. Every time Dexter fades into the background, Dokes steps into the foreground. Like the shadow that finally realizes it isn't attached to the body it's been following. Let's kick things off with what makes him so dangerous. Dokes isn't catching Dexter with fancy forensics. He's catching him with micro behaviors. The emotional flatness at crime scenes. The odd absences when key suspects die. The way Dexter's professionalism is just a little too perfect, like a man who rehearsed empathy instead of feeling it. These are the tells no CCTV can log, the pattern no database can flag, because they live in the space between what's said and what's performed. To keep this clear, we can track the escalation like an investigation. First, Dokes tails Dexter, testing his hunch that the quiet blood spatter guy doesn't add up. Then he breaks into Dexter's apartment, violating procedure, but following his own code of, I know something's wrong here. Finally, he finds them, the blood slides. Those tiny trophies Dexter thought were the purest expression of his order, his ritual, his control. In that instant, the slides stop being private psychology and become hard evidence. Glass, blood, labels, a portable archive of murder. Dokes doesn't need Dina to feel the collapse. He just has to connect this hidden collection to the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation everyone else is misreading. He sees what others ignore, because he's willing to believe the unthinkable about the man standing next to him at work. Now contrast that with Jack the Ripper. As far as records show, there is no Dokes in Whitechapel, no single-named contemporary pursuer who tails him, breaks into his space, nearly unmasks him. Jack faces a fog of undertrained officers and chaotic files. Dexter faces colleagues with gut instincts, grudges, and daily proximity. In a modern police department, you're not just evading systems, you're evading the guy at the next desk who hates your vibe. And Dexter's response? Kidnapping and imprisoning Dokes in that cabin. This is not the code operating smoothly. This is the code detonating. The central question was always never get caught. Yet, here he is, holding a living, breathing cop in a cage because every other plan has failed. Once that line is crossed, there is no clean exit. Kill Dokes, and you shatter your conscience. Let him go, and you obliterate your cover. Even outsourcing the explosion to Lila only deepens the crater. Along the way, we learned the real rule. Once your shadow has a name and a badge, every option you take will blow something up. Outsourcing the explosion to Lila is where the entire situation mutates. Dexter walks into that cabin with a plan. However twisted, stage Dokes as the Bay Harbor Butcher, plant the dismembered bodies, lace the scene with forensic breadcrumbs, and then erase it all in one controlled blaze. One location. One scapegoat. One last, terrible compromise that keeps the rest of his life intact. On paper, it's elegant. Use his access to the investigation to steer suspicion. Move the trophies and bags from his ocean dumps into Dokes' orbit. Let the task force discover exactly what they're already primed to see. Then, once the narrative is locked in, destroy the cabin so thoroughly that no one can pick apart the seams. Fire is the final plastic sheet. But look at what that really is. This isn't the code's surgical precision anymore. It's theater. It's misdirection. The focus is not just on eliminating a threat, but on manipulating an entire institutional memory, turning colleagues, paperwork, and press conferences into props. To keep this clear, Dexter isn't just killing a man in a room. He's trying to choreograph an entire city's belief about who the monster is. And that's exactly where Lila slides in, as the unpredictable variable, an outsider to the code, an obsessive who romanticizes Dexter's darkness instead of containing it. She learns too much, follows him when she shouldn't, breaks into the cabin, and sees the caged cop he swore he wouldn't kill. From a narrative standpoint, she is the embodiment of what happens when someone else starts improvising inside your supposedly perfect plan. Her decision is brutally simple. Light the fuse. Blow up the cabin with Dokes still inside. In one move, she removes Dexter's primary threat and completes the frame job for him. But she also crosses a line he spent an entire season pretending he wouldn't cross. An innocent man dies. The Bay Harbor Butcher investigation concludes, and Dexter's moral stain deepens in a way he can never fully wash off, no matter how he rationalizes that he didn't strike the match. This is the collateral explosion effect. One investigator gets too close. One bloodslide goes missing. One remote cabin is discovered. Suddenly the plan requires kidnapping, framing, arson, and an accessory murderer just to keep the original lie standing. Each major section will keep returning to this pattern. A single slip in a modern environment doesn't just threaten exposure. It demands increasingly extreme actions to patch the hole. The failure doesn't stay local. It propagates. Now contrast that with Jack the Ripper's world. No centralized database tracking patterns. No CTV catching late-night movements. No colleagues logging chain of custody on every scrap of evidence. When Jack killed, there was terror, rumor, and Victorian incompetence, but no dense web of interlocking records forcing him into high-stakes improvisation. He didn't need to frame a rival, torch a crime scene, or manage a task force narrative. In this video, we're going to keep pressing on that gap. If this is what happens when one cop with good instincts corners Dexter, what happens when the entire system, data, technology, and multiple agencies starts closing in from all sides? La Guerta is where Dexter's fantasy of control quietly goes to die. Not on a kill table, not in a back alley, but in conference rooms, evidence lockers, and the dead weight of old case files that refuse to stay buried. To keep this clear, we have to reframe her. She isn't just the ambitious boss who clashes with our protagonist. She's the show's embodiment of institutional memory. She remembers Dokes as a cop, not a headline. She remembers patterns in the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation that never quite added up. Where everyone else moves on to the next season's big case, she keeps circling the same unanswered questions. Her doubts about Dokes don't come from sentimentality. They come from his record. Decorated service. Brutal honesty. A man who might punch a suspect, but not carve them into neat harbor trash bags. The official narrative says Dokes is the butcher, and the cabin explosion is the end of the story. La Guerta looks at his history, his psychology, his proximity to other cases, and feels the plan is off. Why would a methodical killer suddenly get sloppy? Why does the evidence line up too perfectly? So she does what institutions do best when they're not being actively sabotaged. She digs. Case files pulled from storage, archived blood reports, chain of custody logs, old witness statements, interdepartmental conversations with people who barely remember the details until she prompts them. Piece by piece, she reconstructs an alternate version of the Bay Harbor investigation, one where Dokes is chasing the butcher, not being him. And in that reconstruction, Dexter starts to appear, not as a smoking gun, as a pattern of adjacency. He's the analyst on the key reports. He's present at the right crime scenes. His transfer forms, his lab results, his incident reports all sit there, innocuous on their own, but ominous when read in sequence. The focus is not just on one mistake, it's on how often Dexter is standing next to the anomaly. How many times can someone be near the failure point before it stops looking like coincidence? This is the power of paperwork. The blood slides are gone, the bodies are at the bottom of the ocean, but the internal memos remain. The emails about resource allocation, the sign-out sheets for boats and lab equipment. The original Bay Harbor Task Force briefings. Years later, La Guerta can walk back through those documents with fresh suspicion and see a trajectory Dexter never planned for. Contrast that with Jack the Ripper's world. Fragmented, handwritten notes, lost files, witness statements that vanish into bureaucratic fog. No standardized crime scene preservation, no digital archive, no centralized database to revisit when a new theory emerges. Victorian investigators don't have a La Guerta who can open a shared drive and rerun the entire investigation with a different suspect in mind. Once the moment passes, the trail decays. Dexter's greatest shield, the badge, the lab coat, the access turns on him precisely because the institution remembers. His code depends on using police data to find targets. La Guerta uses that same data to find him. Her persistence forces him into that final catastrophic choice on the shipping container dock, murdering her to protect the lie. It's a collapse his code can't cleanly rationalize, because this isn't about stopping a monster. It's about silencing memory. And that's the ominous lesson sitting under all of this. You can outsmart a person in the moment. You can improvise your way past a single investigation. But outsmarting an institution's memory over years, outsmarting the slow, patient accumulation of records and doubts, that's a different game entirely. How long can any meticulous killer survive once the paperwork itself turns predatory? So, when the paperwork turns predatory, where does that pressure finally explode? It explodes on a cold slab of concrete at the shipping container yard, the same kind of industrial graveyard where Dexter's life began, and where his illusion of control really starts to die. We're back at the docks, back at the metal womb of his origin trauma, and the show makes that geography do the talking. Rusting containers. Sodium lights buzzing, the distant echo of the ocean that once swallowed his victims. This isn't just an isolated spot for a clean execution. It's a ritual circle, closing in on itself, a place where every plan, every safeguard, every line of the code is about to collide with public reality, even if no crowd is there to watch. LaGuerta doesn't stumble into this by accident. Her investigation has been grinding toward Dexter for an entire season, using the very institutional memory we just talked about. Old Bay Harbor butcher files, Dokes' reputation, the pattern of the dumps. To keep this clear, she corners him into a brutal binary: preserve the code and accept exposure, or break the code to protect the mask he wears at Miami Metro. There is no third option that keeps both the monster and the persona intact. And then Deborah walks in, and that binary fractures into something much uglier. Now, it's a three-way moral collision: LaGuerta's professional integrity, Dexter's sacred code, Deborah's catastrophic loyalty. What does Deb do? Save the woman upholding the law. Or save the brother who has been rewriting her psychology since childhood? The central question in that scene isn't who dies. It's which value system gets sacrificed on that concrete. Dexter's choice is decisive, and it's wrong by his own rules. LaGuerta is not a code-approved target. She's not a murderer he has verified through careful investigation. She is a cop doing her job, trying to stop a serial killer. When he plunges the bullet into her, he's not serving justice. He's killing the investigation itself. In that instant, his lifelong self-justification as a necessary monster collapses in on itself, and the contamination spreads. Deb pulls the trigger, and her psyche shatters. The department's future is poisoned by a secret it never even know it carries. Dexter's internal narrative that he only kills those who deserve it, that the code is a moral firewall, rots from the inside. From this point in the trajectory, every subsequent kill is haunted by LaGuerta's body on that floor. Contrast that with Jack the Ripper. As far as we know, he never had to execute an investigator, never had to weaponize a loved one's loyalty in real time just to stay hidden. No partner to betray, no captain to silence, no institution closing in with case files and surveillance. In this video, we're going to keep returning to that gap, the more complex the social and institutional web. The more a modern killer like Dexter is forced into killing outside his own rules just to maintain cover. And once the code breaks in public like this, even if no one sees it happen, the scaffolding holding Dexter together has already started to rot. The question isn't whether it will collapse, it's how many people it will crush on the way down. So when we talk about collapse, we also have to talk about disappearance. Dexter's life is a long, grinding investigation closing in. Jack the Ripper's story, by contrast, is a magic trick. One day there's a flurry of bodies in Whitechapel, and then, abruptly, nothing. Let's kick things off with that vanishing point. In 1888, we move from Marianne Nichols to Annie Chapman to Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, and finally to Mary Jane Kelly. The tempo accelerates, the mutilations escalate, the fear spikes. Then the pattern just stops. No arrest. No final showdown. No confirmed last kill that ties a neat bow on the case. The trail goes cold, and it stays cold. From there, the central question becomes not how did he outsmart everyone, but how easy was it to simply fall out of view? In a world without centralized identification, without national databases, without any real intercity coordination, all the leading theories are disturbingly plausible. Maybe he died of illness or violence. Maybe he was imprisoned for some unrelated crime under a different name. Maybe he emigrated to America or the colonies. Or maybe he just chose to stop and walked away. In that context, reinvention isn't a complex plan. It's a train ticket and a convincing lie. To keep this clear, imagine the mechanics. No driver's licenses, no linked medical records, no uniform fingerprint system in daily use, and certainly no DNA. Police in one district barely talk to the next, let alone to another city or country. You can be suspected in Whitechapel on Monday and anonymous in Manchester by Friday. The focus is not just on how brutal Jack was, but on how forgiving the infrastructure was to anyone who wanted to disappear. Now drop Dexter into that comparison, and the illusion of his control looks very different. He lives in a world where his fingerprints are cataloged, his DNA is logged, his employment history is archived, his medical records are digitized, his family ties are mapped in government systems and social media. Every season adds more threads to that web. Even if he stopped killing tomorrow, the past doesn't evaporate. It's frozen in lab reports he authored, case files he helped build, surveillance footage he walked through, and the memories of colleagues, lovers, and a son who watched him bleed out a story about who he really was. And time, for Dexter, is not a friend. Modern cold case units reopen boxes. Forensic tech keeps upgrading. Old samples get retested, databases expand, cross-jurisdiction searches that were impossible become routine. A blood trace that meant nothing in 2006 can trigger a hit in 2026. Each major section will show that what once looked like a clean escape is really just deferred exposure, waiting for the right algorithm. That's the paradox we're sitting with. Jack's greatest skill may have been doing nothing at exactly the right historical moment, while Dexter can never truly do nothing, because his entire life is embedded in permanent systems. Along the way, every failure he survives is not a victory, it's a countdown. And as those systems grow more powerful, we have to ask, how long can any Bay Harbor butcher stay buried before the future digs him up? So when we ask how long the future can keep digging, we're not talking in metaphors. Dexter's ghost is literally made of paperwork and pixels. Even if his body disappears in a storm, his life is still sitting in climate-controlled archives, waiting for the next investigation that needs a fresh angle. Let's kick things off with the basics. Dexter leaves behind a bureaucratic biography, employment records from Miami Metro, payroll and benefits files, HR incident reports, internal emails about overtime and case assignments, lab access logs that track his keycard swipes to the minute, case reports with his name on the signature line, and surveillance footage of him moving through hallways, evidence rooms, and parking garages. Every season adds more. Every new plan he makes at work generates another line in a database that says, in effect, Dexter Morgan was here. To keep this clear, we have to remember how modern institutions work. None of that data lives in a single filing cabinet Dexter can burn. Those emails are mirrored on multiple servers. Those logs are backed up automatically. Old case files get scanned, digitized, and stored off-site. Even if Dexter were to pull a Lila and torch a building, he's not erasing himself. He's just creating an arson file that also has his name in it. And the longer time passes, the more dangerous those remnants become. In this video, we're going to keep returning to the idea that Dexter's greatest enemy is not a rival killer, but the slow upgrade cycle of forensic science. Future detectives can reopen the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation, rerun old blood samples with new DNA techniques, cross-reference Dexter's casework with missing persons databases that didn't exist in 2007, and map his movements against cell tower records and traffic cameras that were once ignored. What happens when someone notices how often Dexter's lab work touches Trinity, the ice truck killer, and the Butcher case itself? That's the pattern hiding in plain sight. His proximity. He processes the blood for the ice truck killer. He's the star analyst during the Bay Harbor Butcher panic. He inserts himself into Trinity's orbit, and then, conveniently, Trinity vanishes. Each re-examination tightens the circle. Each season of his life leaves another trail of timestamps and signatures that make coincidence a harder sell. Now, contrast that with Jack the Ripper. Outside the murders, Jack barely exists. No confirmed home address, no employment file, no verified photograph, not even a consensus on his real name. His data is rumor, misremembered testimony, and newspaper hysteria. The central question with Jack is identity. Was he a butcher, a doctor, a sailor, a nobody? With Dexter, the question is not who he was. It's how far his documented life will eventually incriminate him. We already live in an era of posthumous detection, killers unmasked decades later through DNA, genealogy sites, and quiet archival research. The infrastructure of Dexter's life is too dense for him to dissolve into myth. He can flee Miami, fake a death, even die peacefully in some cabin, but he cannot outrun the servers, the backup drives, the dusty boxes in evidence storage. Along the way, the dark passenger may finally rest. The data will not. Long after Dexter stops breathing, something else will still be watching him. The cold, patient memory of the systems he thought he controlled. If Dexter is haunted by databases, Jack the Ripper is haunted by the opposite. A void. No files, no DNA, no CTV, just a handful of mutilated bodies and a century plus of projection. In this video, we're going to use that void as a mirror. Because the central question isn't who was smarter, it's why we keep mistaking missing information for criminal genius. Let's kick things off with the image we've all inherited. The top hat cutting through the London fog. The surgeon's hands working with inhuman precision. The gentleman ghost vanishing down a Whitechapel alley while terrified constables arrive seconds too late. From that silhouette, we build a mind, strategic, disciplined, always 3 moves ahead. But that's not evidence. That's costume design. The less we know, the more we upgrade the killer. Narrative gaps invite projection. No arrest must mean perfect planning. No clear motive must mean unfathomable psychology. No confirmed identity must mean a mastermind who danced around the investigation. In reality, it mostly means the investigation was weak, the records were chaotic, and the city itself was a smokescreen. To keep this clear, we need to look at what Jack was actually up against. Gas lamps and blind corners, overcrowded slums where screams were background noise, no standardized crime scene preservation, no DNA, limited fingerprint use, and witness statements taken in the middle of panic, darkness, and alcohol. Offender profiling was barely a concept. Interagency data sharing was a fantasy. The system didn't just fail. It was never built to succeed. Now compare that to Dexter, whose every plan unfolds under fluorescent lights and surveillance cameras. He stalks targets in a city mapped by traffic cams, credit card logs, and cell phone pings. His code leans on modern investigation. He reads case files, cross-checks databases, anticipates forensics. The focus is not just on how he kills, but on how he hides inside a machine designed to notice patterns. Meanwhile, many of Jack's clever moves are just basic opportunism. Foggy nights, crowded streets, drunk victims, fast exits into a maze of alleys. That's not 4D chess. That's using environmental chaos as free camouflage. If Dexter dumped bodies in a cesspool of unlit courtyards with no cameras and no lab techs, his life would look a lot more genius too, at least on paper. Each major section will keep circling this mismatch in difficulty. Because if Jack operated today with the same level of sloppiness, bloody clothes, public attacks, zero digital hygiene, he'd be flagged on cameras, triangulated by movement, and either caught in life or reconstructed posthumously. The myth survives precisely because he was never unmasked. No mundane, fallible face ever replaced the fog-shrouded outline. So what happens when we flip it? If Jack's supposed brilliance is mostly a forensic mirage built from absence, then Dexter's very visible failures, the near catches, the blown cover stories, the investigations that close in might be proof of something else, that he's been playing on nightmare mode the entire time. And nightmare mode is about to get worse. Nightmare mode looks abstract until we zoom in on Dexter's daily reality. Every sunrise, he walks into the one building in Miami where the entire architecture of modern detection is pointed directly at men like him. Lab audits, chain of custody logs, case reviews, performance evaluations, coworkers whose full-time job is to notice patterns, anomalies, and lies. And Dexter doesn't just pass through that system. He lives inside it. He works the crime scenes he created the night before, stands over his own blood spatter, while Batista, Masuka, and an active serial killer task force dissect trajectories and timelines. Meanwhile, his phone is pinging towers, his car is caught on traffic cameras, his credit cards and key cards leave digital footprints that would have turned Jack the Ripper into a cold case footnote within a week. To keep this clear, we need to remember how serial killers actually fare in this environment. Most modern offenders are not decades-long phantoms. They're caught after a handful of linked murders, sometimes after one, because CTV catches a license plate, a DINA hit pings across a national database, or a cell phone record drops them into the crime scene grid. The average trajectory is short, messy, and abruptly terminated by an arrest photo. Against that backdrop, Dexter's double life isn't just dramatic television. It's statistically bizarre. Years of ritualized killing, while embedded in a homicide division, raising a family, navigating spouses, girlfriends, stepkids, and later Harrison. Parent-teacher conferences and birthday parties on one side, kill rooms and ocean dumps on the other. The central question becomes less, why does Dexter slip up so much? And more, how did this not collapse immediately? Because those slips we fixate on, Dokes circling him on pure instinct, LaGuardia resurrecting the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation, Leela torching cabins and blowing up plans, Trinity detonating Dexter's suburban fantasy, are not proof that he's incompetent. They are the inevitable pressure fractures of a system where every new forensic tool, every new database, every new relationship multiplies his exposure. On nightmare mode, the miracle isn't that he almost gets caught, it's that almost keeps repeating. Look at how he responds under that pressure, destroying the blood slides when the investigation closes in, rerouting suspicion onto Dokes without ever planning that outcome, adapting his code to accommodate Lumen, Miguel, then Hannah, improvising ethics in real time just to keep the illusion of control intact. These are not the flailings of an amateur. They're crisis management pivots inside a shrinking maze. Now, contrast that with Jack. No DNA, no standardized crime scene preservation, no CCTV, no cell tower records, no interagency data sharing. A killer could walk away from a mutilated body, wash his hands in a public pump, and vanish into a crowd of identical coats and hats. In that world, even a mediocre offender can look like an untouchable specter. So when we compare Dexter's visible near misses to Jack's clean historical void, we're really comparing different difficulty settings. And in this video, we're going to argue that once you normalize for that difficulty, the scoreboard between them doesn't just shift, it inverts. So let's kick things off by doing the one thing the fandom almost never does when they ask who'd win. We change the map. We normalize the difficulty. We take Jack out of his gaslit alleyways and drop him under the fluorescent glare of Miami Metro. Then we strand Dexter in Jack's fog, where the word forensics might as well be science fiction. To keep this clear, imagine scenario 1, Jack the Ripper in modern Miami. Same psychology, same frenzied street mutilations, same need for proximity and chaos. But now, every corner convenience store has CCTV. Every victim has a phone that's been pinging off cell towers all night. Every scrap of skin under a fingernail is a DNA profile waiting to be cross-checked in a database Jack doesn't even know exists. He grabs a sex worker behind a club. There are cameras on the door, traffic cams on the intersection, Uber logs placing him within a 3-block radius. Patrol cars respond in minutes, not hours. The media storm doesn't build over weeks with lurid newspapers. It detonates overnight with push alerts, podcasts, Reddit threads. Task forces spin up instantly. Behavioral profilers, digital forensics, interagency data sharing. How long before that mysterious figure is at least identified, even if he somehow slips arrest? Days? A single season of his career? At most? Now flip it. Scenario 2. Dexter Morgan wakes up in 1888 Whitechapel. No cameras, no DNA, no centralized records. The streets are overcrowded, filthy, numbed by poverty and violence. Screams are background noise. Blood on cobblestones is just Thursday. The investigation is chalk outlines and guesswork, not luminol and fiber analysis. Dexter's whole plan has always been built on control. Stalk the target, confirm the victims, prepare the kill room. In Miami, each step is a potential failure point because the environment pushes back. In Whitechapel, that same methodical stalking becomes overkill, but in the opposite sense. He doesn't need plastic-wrapped rooms to disappear. A half-abandoned warehouse or a quiet stretch of riverbank would make him a ghost. His awareness of trace evidence, of how scenes get processed, would make him paranoid about problems the police literally cannot see. Ironically, his trademark rituals become decorative. The meticulous taping, the drains, the bleach. In an era before standardized crime scene preservation, he's playing 4-dimensional chess against opponents who haven't learned the rules of checkers. The focus is not just on how smart he is, but on how far beyond the minimal requirements his operational skill set actually scales in Jack's world. Meanwhile, Jack's habits collapse in Dexter's. Public frenzies, outdoor crime scenes, and signature mutilations are exactly the kind of pattern modern investigations are built to crush. Dexter's, by contrast, are designed to look like nothing at all. So, if the central question is, who's better? What happens when the matchup itself is the illusion? Along the way, we may find we've been measuring the wrong thing entirely, and the real comparison is much more uncomfortable. Fear doesn't just react to monsters, it manufactures them. Once a killer crosses a certain threshold of public panic, we stop talking about a man with limits and start talking about a presence with reach, power, and almost supernatural control. Jack the Ripper is the blueprint for this. 5 canonical murders in filthy Whitechapel streets become, through newspapers and rumor, an omnipresent phantom genius. Victorian London is already on edge, immigration flooding the East End, grinding poverty, sex work in every alley, the sense that the capital of an empire is rotting from the inside. The Ripper investigation doesn't calm that anxiety, it concentrates it. Every mutilated body is framed as proof that the city's moral fabric is collapsing, that the foreign and the poor are breeding an evil the old order can't contain. In this video, we're going to treat that as a fear factory. Sensational headlines, fake Ripper letters, politicians promising crackdowns on vice districts rather than fixing housing or policing. The focus is not just on the crimes, but on how quickly the Ripper stops being a man and becomes a symbol of everything respectable London thinks is wrong with the modern world. To keep this clear, the operational reality, no forensics, chaotic crime scenes, incompetent coordination, gets buried under the myth of a mastermind outwitting the system. Miami does the same thing with the Bay Harbor butcher, just with a different costume. Dexter's body dumps are discovered, the investigation ramps up, and almost immediately the public conversation splits. On one side, horror at a serial killer using the ocean as a graveyard. On the other, a twisted folk hero fantasy. Someone is cleaning up the streets, taking out rapists, traffickers, and predators the courts let walk. That dark Avenger psychology is powerful. It lets people feel safer while objectively being in more danger. Politicians and police leadership ride both waves. Victorian officials use the Ripper to demand more officers and harsher laws, posturing as defenders of decency while the investigation flounders. In Miami, LaGuardia, the Brass, even the feds use the Bay Harbor butcher case to argue for task forces, budgets, and public trust. Each major section of the media cycle becomes about image management, who looks tough on crime, who looks in control, who can promise that this will never happen again. And here's the crucial distortion. The more a killer becomes a story, the less anyone cares about operational reality, and the more they care about archetypes. Jack is elevated into the untouchable phantom genius. Dexter is mythologized as the meticulous dark avenger with a code. Fear acts as a force multiplier. It fills in every gap in evidence with imagined competence. Ordinary opportunism becomes legendary mastery. Sloppy Victorian policing becomes proof of Jack's brilliance. Lila, blowing up dokes, becomes proof that Dexter's plan was flawless. So when we ask who wins between Dexter and Jack, we're already trapped inside that theater. If the central question is power, we have to step outside the fear factories. Along the way, the matchup is going to look very different once we strip away the myth and run the cold operational math. So if the central question is power, we need evidence, not vibes. Let's kick things off by treating Dexter's life like what it really is. One long, messy case file of operational failure. From a severed doll head in Dexter's fridge to a body laid out on a neatly wrapped table. The ice truck killer investigation is supposed to be Dexter's playground. He has access to the lab, the crime scenes, the blood. Control, right? But Brian turns every one of those advantages against him. He reconstructs Dexter's childhood, stalks Deb, and forces a choice between the code and his own brother. The perfect compartmentalization between work, family, and killing collapses in a single kill room. That's our template. Season 2 scales it. Dexter's ocean dumps, his blood slides, his meticulous cleanups all converge into the Bay Harbor butcher investigation. The very system he built to reduce risk becomes the pattern that exposes him. Dokes doesn't need dinner or CCTV. He just watches Dexter's behavior, feels the psychology underneath the act, and refuses to look away. When Leela blows up the cabin, we're not watching a clever escape. We're watching a plan so fragile it can only survive because another unstable person commits arson and murder on Dexter's behalf. That's not control. That's a near random save. Then, Miguel Prado. To keep this clear, Dexter designs a new system, mentorship, shared code, extra vetting, stalk the target, confirm the victims, prepare the kill room. Miguel weaponizes each step. He learns the ritual, breaks the rules, and starts freelancing homicides under Dexter's brand. The more structure Dexter adds, the more surface area there is for corruption and exposure. Trinity is the same pattern, but deadlier. Dexter thinks he's infiltrating, managing, maybe even redeeming a fellow killer. Instead, he underestimates Arthur's volatility, misreads the family dynamics, and leaves Rita unprotected. His plan to study Trinity from the inside doesn't just fail, it detonates his entire suburban fantasy. Rita's death is not a random tragedy. It is the logical consequence of a man who believes he can run 2 full lives and 2 full investigations at once. By the time we reach Deb's death, the trajectory is locked. Every layer of protection Dexter built around her, lies, half-truths, the code, even his decision to flee Miami, feeds into the chain of events that puts her in that hospital bed. The final Mercy killing is framed as control, but it's really the last link in a long chain of collapses. Now, contrast that with Jack the Ripper. No blood slides, no ritualized plastic, no long-term system to maintain. One-off, opportunistic violence in filthy gaslit streets with no DINA, no databases, no CCTV. Where Dexter's routines generate data points, Jack's chaos erases them. Modern tools that would crucify the Bay Harbor butcher never touch Whitechapel. So when we put them side by side, we're not just comparing 2 killers. We're comparing a self-built trap to a man who was, by design and by era, almost impossible to catch. In this video, we're going to push that contrast even further. So let's kick things off with the uncomfortable truth. Dexter isn't losing to Jack because Jack is smarter. He's losing because he's playing on nightmare difficulty, while Jack was basically in the tutorial. One moves through a city that records everything. The other moved through a city that remembered nothing accurately. In Miami, every step of Dexter's plan leaves a scar in the data. License plates on traffic cams. His car caught in the background of CCTV near a dump site. Cell tower pings, quietly sketching his trajectory across the city. Even when he thinks he's invisible, digital payments timestamp his gas, his plastic wrap, his late-night coffee. Modern policing doesn't need a genius detective breathing down his neck. It needs a patient analyst watching patterns accumulate. How do you outsmart a system that never sleeps and never forgets? And the irony is brutal. The very job that gives Dexter access to investigations is the job that keeps him trapped inside them. As a blood spatter analyst, he's always at the crime scene, always on the record, always one internal review away from someone asking, why is Dexter here again? Season after season, his supposed advantage collapses into exposure. Dokes doesn't catch him because of some supernatural insight. He just notices that Dexter's presence, Dexter's timing, Dexter's calm around horror never quite line up with normal psychology. To keep this clear, imagine Jack the Ripper trying to operate under that level of scrutiny. Victorian London had fragmented policing, no integrated databases, barely standardized forensics, and records that could vanish in a filing cabinet or a fire. Jack could walk out of Whitechapel with blood on his cuffs and melt into a crowd where everyone's clothes were stained Everyone's stories were messy, and no one had a body cam. When the investigation reset each morning, it reset from rumor, not from hard data. So the central question isn't who's the better killer, it's who's being measured by reality. Jack's so-called genius is inflated by absence. No fingerprint systems in routine use, no CTV, no cell logs, no interagency sharing. His trail was swallowed by fog, by fear, by institutional blind spots. Dexter's failures, by contrast, are over-documented. The Bay Harbor butcher case literally grows out of the blood slides he lovingly keeps. New Blood turns one small town cop with internet access into a fatal threat. This is what it looks like when the code meets a fully weaponized surveillance state. Along the way, we've been trained to read that contrast backwards. Jack becomes a mythic mastermind, Dexter becomes the guy who messed up. But when we zoom out, the focus is not just on competence, it's on context. Put Dexter in 1888, and he's a ghost. Put Jack in modern Miami, and he's a case study in rapid arrest. In the next section, we're going to follow that logic through Dexter's worst manhunts and watch how the system, not just his mistakes, closes in. So let's kick things off by stripping away the fog machine around Jack the Ripper. When people say Jack was a genius, they're not talking about documented strategy. They're talking about a vibe. Gaslit alleys, foggy cobblestones, lurid headlines screaming about a phantom in Whitechapel. Jack's intelligence is mostly the psychology of fear, projected onto an empty space where real information should be. In this video, we're going to lean on something very simple. We know almost nothing concrete about Jack's planning. What we do know is how his legend was constructed. Sensationalist newspapers competing for sales printed every rumor as if it were evidence. Artists drew melodramatic illustrations of a caped figure melting into the dark. Hoax letters flooded the investigation, many now believed to be written by journalists themselves. Out of that chaos, the culture stitched together a mastermind. Because incompetent investigation plus bad lighting doesn't sell papers. To keep this clear, most of Jack's supposed tactics are retroactive fan fiction. We take incomplete case files, contaminated crime scenes, and contradictory witness statements, and read intention into every gap. He vanished quickly, so it must have been a plan. He picked a small area, so it must have been a coded hunting ground. He wasn't caught, so he must have been brilliant. Or was he just operating in a pre-forensic era with no CTV, and almost no standardized crime scene control? Contrast that with Dexter. We see everything, every plan, every failure, every time the code promises control, and then collapses the moment reality pushes back. From the ice truck killer turning Dexter's own childhood into a stage, to Dokes tracking him on pure instinct, to Trinity slipping through his fingers while the body count rises, there is no blank space where we can paste in genius. The camera refuses to look away when his ritual gets sloppy, when a blood slide goes missing, when a kill room almost becomes a confession booth. That visibility makes Dexter feel less mythic, but more human. We watch him misread people. We watch him underestimate investigations. We watch him believe the code will insulate him from consequences, only for a single mistake in one season to ricochet 3 seasons later. There's no room to pretend that every escape was part of the design. We're there for the panic, the improvisation, the sheer luck. Now imagine Jack under that level of scrutiny. Imagine modern Miami, DNA swabs, interagency databases, digital footprints from every burner phone, cameras on every corner. Imagine a killer who leaves bodies in public streets, with visible mutilation, trying to repeat that pattern even twice. Does that look like a shadowy mastermind, or like a man arrested before sunrise? The central question isn't who's smarter, it's who's being seen. Jack's genius is what we invent to fill an archival void. Dexter's incompetence is what we're forced to confront, because the show gives us no place to hide. In the next section, we'll push that contrast even harder by following Dexter through the manhunts that finally strip his own myth down to the bone. So let's kick things off by tightening the lens on what we actually mean when we ask who wins. Because if the central question is just body count or years uncaught, the matchup is over before it starts. Jack racks up a handful of canonical murders in a few months and vanishes into fog. Dexter kills for years across 2 separate lives. On raw statistics, Dexter looks like the heavyweight. But the focus is not just on numbers. The focus is on survivability, on operational resilience, on the psychological cost it takes to keep the plan going when the investigation closes in. In this video, we're going to reframe winning as a Crossera stress test, whose system still functions when you rip them out of their home environment and drop them into the other's world. To keep this clear, imagine Dexter in 1888 Whitechapel. No Dina, no CTV, no standardized crime scene preservation. At first glance, he looks overpowered. A trained blood spatter analyst with Harry's code, walking through a policing system that can't even secure a perimeter. Yet Dexter's entire method depends on modern infrastructure, police databases, case files, lab access. A steady stream of official investigations he can parasitize. Strip that away, and his ritual doesn't just wobble, it collapses. How does he confirm guilt now? How does a man obsessed with control operate in a world where information is rumor and witness statements, not digital certainty? The same thing happens in reverse. Drop Jack the Ripper into modern Miami, and his crude street corner blitz attacks last maybe one night. A bloody knife, public alleys, predictable hunting grounds, no attempt to manage trace evidence at all. CTV, cell tower pings, license plate readers, interagency data sharing. The environment does more work than any genius detective. Jack isn't outsmarted, he's outclassed by the basic operating system of contemporary law enforcement. That's the paradox. Dexter looks smarter, but his sophistication is a liability. Every safeguard he trusts becomes a trail. Blood slides, boat trips, computer searches. The very code that's supposed to limit collateral damage drives him into closer proximity with investigations, colleagues, and family members who can expose him. Every season, that tension escalates. Dokes reading his patterns. Lundy mapping the Bay Harbor butcher's trajectory. Harrison in Iron Lake staring at the gap between Dexter's story and the bodies in the snow. The psychology that lets him function also makes him break. Jack's success, by contrast, is almost entirely circumstantial. He benefits from a narrow window where anonymity is cheap, oversight is weak, and press hysteria muddies every lead. The letters, the taunting, the myth-making, those are smokescreens that survive because the system beneath them is catastrophically unprepared. So who actually wins? Neither. Each man only works inside his own broken context. Dexter loses to his environment. Jack wins because of his. And as we move into the next section, we'll watch what happens when Dexter's environment finally turns against him for good. So when we say Dexter loses to his environment, Jack wins because of his. We're not just scoring a hypothetical match. We're exposing why we even want a match in the first place. Why do we keep turning serial killers into combatants? Drawing brackets like this is a tournament instead of a trail of bodies. In this video, we're going to treat that impulse itself like an investigation. Dexter versus Jack the Ripper isn't really about who would outsmart whom. It's about us trying to put horror inside a plan. Rank it. Compare it. Turn it into something with rules and win conditions so it feels less like chaos and more like a strategy game we can solve from the couch. Think about how these debates work. We talk about Dexter's code like it's a build in an RPG. We min-max his access to databases, his kill rooms, his plastic. Then we stack that against Jack's filthy alleys, gas lamps, and vanishing into Whitechapel fog. Underneath the fake who wins? Bravado is the central question. Can evil be systematized, modeled, controlled, if we just think hard enough about it? To keep this clear, look at how we respond to Dexter's failures. Every season gives us a new collapse. Dokes closing in on pure instinct. The Bay Harbor butcher case, built out of the very blood slides Dexter thought made him untouchable. Trinity walking straight into Dexter's family fantasy and detonating it from the inside. On paper, these are disasters, yet watching the plan fall apart is reassuring. We see cause and effect. Mistake, consequence, aftermath. Dexter misses a detail. Someone notices a pattern. The investigation tightens. Systems react. Friends get suspicious. There is a grim comfort in that feedback loop. It tells us that monsters are not infinite. They're bounded by logistics, by human error, by other people's agency. Even when the cost is brutal, we can trace the trajectory from choice to outcome. Jack is the opposite sensation. No fee, no Dina, no standardized crime scene protocol, just a few blocks of London, a handful of bodies, and then nothing but letters, hoaxes, and speculation. His violence feels random, untraceable, immune to closure. We can't point to the exact beat where the plan fails because, as far as the record shows, his plan never does. That's why Jack haunts in a way Dexter can't. Dexter's story ends in a prison cell and a bullet. Jack's story ends in a question mark. One gives us a file we can close. The other gives us an open tab in our brain that never quite stops loading. The focus is not just on which killer would win, but on which fear wins inside us. Dexter exposes our anxiety about systems breaking down, about institutions catching monsters too late. Jack exposes something colder, the possibility that some violence will never be explained, never be solved, never even be correctly named. Each major section will keep circling this mirror. Because when we crown serial killer champions, we're really ranking which kind of vulnerability scares us more. The failure of control we can see, or the absence of control we never even detect. And as we move into Dexter's final unraveling, that distinction is going to hit much closer to home than any fantasy crossover fight. And that brings us back to the fake versus the fog. To keep this clear, the central question was never who would win in a Backley knife fight, but whose entire way of surviving even works outside their specific historical glitch. Dexter's carefully engineered system keeps slamming into modern pressure. Jack's apparent success is less about supernatural stealth and more about a city drowning in bad lighting, bad records, and worse policing. From bloodslides glowing under lab lights, to Dokes staring through a cage, at the real Bay Harbor butcher, to Batista and Angela quietly connecting dots Dexter thought were scattered forever. His control doesn't just wobble. It collapses. Again and again, the investigation catches up. Every season adds another failure. The ice truck killer, weaponizing his childhood. Trinity detonating his family fantasy. New blood turning his exile into a crime scene. The code that was supposed to protect him becomes a trail of ritual, pattern, and access that any determined task force can follow. Jack is the opposite problem. No code. No ritualized plastic. No forensic age to press against. He walks through filthy Whitechapel streets with a bloody knife. Then vanishes into a crowd that no one is systematically tracking. No dna. Primitive fingerprints. No standardized crime scene preservation. What looks like genius is mostly a void: missing files, contaminated alleys, newspapers printing hoax letters, while the real killer benefits from the chaos. We remember his absence of consequences as legendary skill because we have almost nothing concrete to contradict it. So when people ask, Dexter versus Jack the Ripper, who wins? The real answer is that the matchup itself is broken. It's a category error. In a world with real scrutiny but pre-forensic tools, Dexter still falls apart because his whole plan depends on police databases, crime scenes, and access that also expose him. In a world with modern tools, Jack's legend never gets off the ground because CTV, digital footprints, and interagency data sharing would turn that small hunting ground into a spotlight. One man is over-documented failure. The other is under-documented myth. In this video, we're going to leave them where they belong. Dexter in a lab he can't control. Jack in a fog that would never survive a single modern evidence locker. The focus is not just on who racks up more bodies, but on how code versus chaos, ritual versus opportunism, and forensic age versus forensic void shape their survivability. Along the way, we've watched the fantasy of the untouchable mastermind shrink down into what it always was, a story we tell to cover the gaps in our own investigation. But now, we want to hear from you. What other impossible matchups should we pull apart next? Which criminal myths, fictional tactics, or legendary cases do you want dragged under the same light? Drop your plans in the comments, hit subscribe if you want more deep dive breakdowns like this, and stay tuned. Next time, we're opening a different file, a killer who never hides, a city that still misses him, and a final twist that makes Dexter's collapse look almost merciful.